You planning on biting the cue again? Because if you are, I'd like to invite the court painter so I can forever remember the sight. Don't you dare mock me. Don't be so serious. He aimed at the ball and sent it gracefully into a green one, which dropped into a pocket. You're immensely entertaining when you're hopping mad. To his surprise and delight, she laughed. Funny to you, she said, infuriating for me. She moved and took another shot. And missed. Let me show you how to do it. He strode over to where she stood and set his stick down, taking hers in his hand. Nudging her out of the way, his heart beating a bit faster, he positioned himself where she stood. You see how my thumb and index finger are always holding the upper end of the cue? All you have to do is, she knocked him out of the way with a swish of her hips and took the rod from him. I know how to hold it, you buffoon. She tried to hit the ball and missed yet again. You're not moving your body the correct way. Here, just let me show you. Though it was the oldest and most shameless trick in the book, he reached over her and put his hand on top of the one that gripped the cue. He then positioned the fingers of her other hand on the wood before lightly gripping her wrist. To Dorian's dismay, his face became warm. His eyes shifted to her, and, to his relief, he found that she was as red as he, if not more so. If you don't stop feeling and start instructing, I'm going to rip out your eyes and replace them with these billiard balls. Look, all you have to do is. He walked her through the steps, and she hit the ball smoothly. It went into a corner and rebounded into a pocket. He removed himself from her and smirked. See? If you do it properly, it'll work. Try again. He picked up his cue. She snorted, but still positioned herself, aimed, and hit it. The cue ball shot all around the table, creating general chaos. But at least she made contact. He grabbed the triangle and held it in the air. Care for a game? The clock struck 2 before they stopped. He had ordered an array of desserts to be brought in the midst of their playing, and though she protested, she gobbled down a large piece of chocolate cake and then ate half of his piece, too. He won every game, yet she hardly noticed. As long as she hit the ball, it assaulted in shameless bragging. Even she missed, well, even the fires of hell couldn't compare to the rage that burst from her mouth. He couldn't remember a time when he'd laughed so hard. When she wasn't cursing and sputtering, they spoke of the books they'd both read, and as she jabbered on and on, he felt as if she hadn't spoken a word in years and was afraid she'd suddenly go mute again. She was frighteningly smart. She understood him when he spoke of history, or of politics, though she claimed to loathe the subject, and even had a great deal to say about the theatre. He somehow wound up promising to take her to a play after the competition. An awkward silence arose at that, but it quickly passed. Dorian was slumped in an armchair, resting his head on a hand. She lay sprawled across the chair facing his, her legs dangling off an arm. She stared at the fire, her eyelids half closed. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. She let her head drop onto the arm of the chair. "Do you think Xavier and the other champion murders were intentional?" "Perhaps." "Does it make a difference?" "No." She lazily waved her hand in the air. "Never mind." Before he could ask more, she fell asleep. He wished he knew more about her past. Keol had only told him that she came from Terrason, and that her family was dead. He hadn't the faintest clue what her life was like, how she became an assassin, how she learned to play the pianoforte. It was all a mystery. He wanted to know everything about her. He wished she'd just tell him. Dorian stood and stretched. He placed their cues on the rack, arranged the balls, and returned to the slumbering assassin. He shook her gently, and she groaned in protest. "You may want to sleep there, but you'll sorely regret it in the morning." Barely opening her eyes, She stood and shuffled to the door. When she nearly walked into the doorpost, he decided that a guiding arm was needed before she broke something. Trying not to think of the warmth of her skin beneath his hand, he directed her to her bedroom and watched her stagger into bed, where she collapsed on top of the blankets. "Your books are there," she mumbled, pointing at a stack by her bed. He slowly entered the chamber. She lay still, her eyes closed. 3 candles burned on various surfaces. With a sigh, he moved to blow them out before approaching her bed. Was she sleeping? "Good night, Kalina," he said. It was the first time he'd addressed her by her name. It came off his tongue nicely. She mumbled something that sounded like Nana and did not move. A curious necklace glittered in the hollow of her throat. He felt as if it were familiar somehow, like he'd seen it before. With a final glance, he picked up the stack of books and left the room. If she became his father's champion, and later gained her freedom, would she remain the same? Or was this all a fake to get what she wanted? But he couldn't imagine that she was pretending. Didn't want to imagine that she was pretending. The castle was silent and dark as he walked back to his room. Chapter 29. At their test the next afternoon, Kalina stood in the training hall with her arms crossed, watching Kane spar with Grave. Kane knew who she was. All of her simpering and pretending and holding back had been for nothing. It had amused. She clenched her jaw as Kane and Grave flew across the sparring ring, swords clanging. The test was fairly simple. They were each given a sparring partner, and if they won their duel, they needn't worry about being eliminated. The losers, however, would face judgment by Brullo. Whoever had performed the worst would be sent packing. To his credit, Grave held up well against Kane, even though she saw how his knees trembled from the effort. Nox, standing beside her, hissed as Kane shoved into Grave and sent him staggering back. Kane smiled throughout the entire thing, barely panting. Kalina clenched her hands into fists, pushing them hard against her ribs. In a flash of steel, Kane had his blade at Grave's throat, and the pock-marked assassin bared his rotting teeth at him. "Excellent," Kane BN_Low said, clapping. Kalina struggled to control her breathing. "Look out," Kane Verin said from beside her. The curly-headed thief grinned at her. She hadn't been thrilled when it had been announced she was to spar against Verin. But at least it wasn't Nox. "Little lady wants a piece of you." "Watch yourself," Verin Nox warned, his grey eyes burning. "What?" Verin said. Now the other champions, and everyone else, were turning to them. Pelea, who had been lingering nearby, retreated a few steps. "Smart move. Defending her, are you?" Verin taunted. "Is that the bargain? She opens her legs, and you keep an eye on her during practice." "Shut your mouth, you damned pig," Kalina snapped. Keol and Dorian pushed off from where they both leaned against the wall, coming closer to the ring. "Or what?" Verin said, nearing her. Nox stiffened, his hand drifting to his sword. But Kalina refused to back down. "Or I'll rip out your tongue." "That's enough." BN_Low barked. "Take it out in the ring." Verin. "Lillian. Now." Verin gave her a snake-like smile, and Kane clapped him on the back as he entered the chalk-etched circle, drawing his sword. Nox put a hand on her shoulder, and out of the corner of her eye, she spied Keol and Dorian watching them closely. She ignored them. It was enough. Enough of the pretending and the meekness. Enough of Kane. Verin raised his sword, shaking his blonde curls out of his eyes. "Let's see what you've got." She stalked toward him, keeping her sword sheathed at her side. Verin's grin widened as he lifted his blade. He swung, but Kalina struck, ramming her fist into his arm, sending the blade soaring through the air. In the same breath, her palm hit his left arm, knocking it aside, too. As he staggered back, Her leg came up, and Verin's eyes bulged as her foot slammed into his chest. The kick sent him flying, and his body crunched as it hit the floor and slid out of the ring, instantly eliminating him. The hall was utterly silent. "Mock me again," she spat at Verin, "and I'll do that with my sword the next time." She turned from him, and found Brullo's face slack. "Here's a lesson for you, weapons master," she said, stalking past him. "Give me real men to fight. Then maybe I'll bother trying." She strode away, past the grinning Nox, and stopped before Cain. She stared up at his face, a face that might have been handsome had he not been a bastard, and smiled with sweet venom. "Here I am," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Just a little lapdog." Cain's black eyes gleamed. "All I hear is yapping." Her hand itched toward her sword, but she kept it at her side. "Let's see if you still hear yapping when I win this competition." Before he could say more, she stalked to the water table. Only Nox dared speak to her after that. Surprisingly, Keol didn't reprimand her, either. Even she was safely back in her rooms after the test. Kalina watched the snowflakes drift from the hills beyond Riftfold. They swept toward her, harbingers of the storm that was to come. The late afternoon sun, trapped beneath a wall of pewter, stained the clouds a yellowish gray, making the sky unusually bright. It felt surreal, as if the horizon had disappeared beyond the hills. She was stranded in a world of glass. Kalina left the window, but stopped before the tapestry and its depiction of Queen Elena. She had often wished for adventure, for old spells and wicked kings. But she hadn't realized it would be like this, a fight for her freedom. And she'd always imagined that there'd be someone to help her, a loyal friend or a one-armed soldier or something. She hadn't imagined she would be so alone. She wished Sam were with her. He'd always known what to do, always had her back, whether she wanted him to or not. She would give anything, anything in the world, to have him still with her. Her eyes burned, and Kalina put a hand to the amulet. The metal was warm beneath her fingers, comforting, somehow. She took a step back from the tapestry to better study the entire scope of it. In the center stood a stag, magnificent and virile, gazing sideways at Elena. The symbol of the royal house of Terasen, of the kingdom that Brannon, Elena's father, had founded. A reminder that though Elena had become Queen of Adalon, she still belonged to Terasen. Like Kalina, no matter where Elena went, no matter how far, Terasen would always own a part of her. Kalina listened to the wind howl. With a sigh, she shook her head and turned away. Find the evil in the castle. But the only truly evil thing in this world is the man ruling it. Across the castle, Kaltain Rompia clapped lightly as a troop of acrobats finished their tumbling. The performance had stopped at last. She didn't feel inclined to watch peasants bouncing about in bright colors for hours, but Queen Georgina enjoyed it, and had invited her to sit beside the throne today. It was an honor, and had been arranged through Purrington. Purrington wanted her, she knew it. And if she pushed, she could easily get him to offer to make her his duchess. But duchess wasn't enough, not when Dorian was still unmarried. Her head had been pounding for the past week, and today it seemed to throb with the words, "Not enough. Not enough. Not enough." Even in her sleep, the pain seeped in, warping her dreams into nightmares so vivid she couldn't remember where she was when she awoke. "How delightful, Your Majesty," Kaltain said as the acrobats gathered their things. Yes, they were rather exciting, weren't they? The Queen's green eyes were bright, and she smiled at Kaltain. Just then Kaltain's head gave a bolt of pain so strong she clenched her fists, hiding them in the folds of her tangerine-colored gown. "I do wish Prince Dorian could have seen them," Kaltain got out. "His Highness told me only yesterday how much he enjoyed coming here." The lie was easy enough, and it somehow made the pain of the headache ease. "Dorian said that?" Queen Georgina raised an auburn eyebrow. Does that surprise your majesty? The queen put a hand to her chest. I thought my son had a distaste for such things. Your majesty, she whispered, will you swear not to say a word? A word about what? The queen whispered back. Well, Prince Dorian told me something. What did he say? The queen touched Kaltain's arm. He said that the reason he doesn't come to court so often is because he's rather shy. The queen withdrew, the light in her eyes fading. Oh, he's told me that 100 times. I was so hoping you'd tell me something interesting, Lady Kaltain. Like if he's found a young woman he favors. Kaltain's face warmed, and her head pounded mercilessly. She wished for her pipe, but hours remained of this court session, and it wouldn't be proper to leave until Georgina departed. I heard, said the queen under her breath, that there's a young lady, but no one knows who. Or at least when they hear her name, it's nothing familiar. Do you know her? No, your majesty. Kaltain fought to keep the frustration from her face. What a pity. I had hoped that you of all people would know. You're such a clever girl, Kaltain. Thank you, your majesty. You are too kind. Nonsense. I'm an excellent judge of character. I knew how extraordinary you were the moment you entered the court. Only you are suitable for a man of Purrington's prowess. What a pity you didn't meet my Dorian first. Not enough, not enough, the pain sang. This was her time. Even if I had, Kaltain chuckled, your majesty surely would not have approved. I'm far too lowly for the attentions of your son. Your beauty and wealth compensate for it. Thank you, your majesty. Kaltain's heart pounded quickly. If the queen approved of her. Kaltain could scarcely think as the queen nestled into her throne, then clapped her hands twice. The music began. Kaltain didn't hear it. Purrington had given her the shoes. Now was her time to dance. Chapter 30. You're not focusing. Yes, I am. Kalina said through her teeth, pulling the bowstring back even farther. Then go ahead, Keol said, pointing to a distant target along the far wall of the abandoned hallway. An outrageous distance for anyone, except her. Let's see you make that. She rolled her eyes and straightened her spine a bit. The bowstring quivered in her hand, and she lifted the tip of her arrow slightly. You're going to hit the left wall, he said, crossing his arms. I'm going to hit you in the head if you don't shut up. She turned her head to meet his gaze. His brows rose, and, still staring at him, she smiled wickedly as she blindly fired the arrow. The whiz of the arrow's flight filled the stone hallway before the faint, dull thud of impact. But they remained gazing at each other. His eyes were slightly purple beneath. Hadn't he gotten any sleep in the 3 weeks since Xavier had died? She certainly hadn't been sleeping well, either. Every noise woke her, and Keol hadn't yet discovered who might be targeting the champions one by one. The who didn't matter as much to her as the how. How was the killer selecting them? There was no pattern. 5 were dead, and they had no connection to each other, aside from the competition. She hadn't been able to see another crime scene to determine if wired marks had been painted in blood there as well. Kalina sighed, rolling her shoulders. Kane knows who I am, she said quietly, lowering her bow. His face remained blank. How? Purrington told him. And Kane told me. When? She'd never seen him look so serious. It made something within her strain. A few days ago, she lied. It had been weeks since their confrontation. I was in the garden with Nehemiah with my guards, don't worry, and he approached us. He knows all about me, and knows that I hold back when we're with the other champions. Did he lead you to believe that the other champions know about you? No, she said. I don't think they do. Nox doesn't have a clue. Keol put a hand on the hilt of his sword. It's going to be fine. The element of surprise is gone, that's all. You'll still beat Cain in the duels. She half smiled. You know, it's starting to sound like you actually believe in me. You'd better be careful. He began to say something, but running footsteps sounded from around the corner, and he paused. 2 guards skidded to a stop and saluted them. Keol gave them a moment to collect their breath before he said, "Yes." One of the guards, an aging man with thinning hair, saluted a second time and said, "Captain, you're needed." Though his features remained neutral, Keol's shoulders shifted, and his chin rose a bit higher. "What is it?" he said, a bit too quickly to pass for unconcerned. "Another body," replied the guard. "In the servants' passages." The second guard, a slender, frail-looking young man, was deathly pale. "You saw the body?" Kalina asked him. The guard, "How fresh?" Keol gave her a sharp look. The guard said, "They think it's from last night from the way the blood's half-dried." Keol's eyes were unfocused. Thinking, he was figuring out what to do. He straightened. "You want to prove how good you are?" he asked her. She put her hands on her hips. "Do I even need to?" He motioned the guards to lead the way. "Come with me," he said to her over his shoulder, and, despite the body, she smiled a bit and followed him. As they departed, Kalina looked back at the target. Keol had been right. She'd missed the center by 6 inches, to the left. Thankfully, someone had created some semblance of order before they arrived. Even still, Keol had to push his way through a crowd of gathered guards and servants, Kalina keeping close behind him. When they reached the edge of the crowd and beheld the body, her hands slackened at her sides. Keol cursed with impressive violence. She didn't know where to look first. At the body, with the gaping chest cavity and missing brain and face, at the claw marks gouged into the ground, or at the 2 wired marks, drawn on either side of the body in chalk. Her blood went cold. There was no denying their connection now. The crowd continued talking as the captain approached the body, then turned to one of the guards watching him. "Ivo, is it?" "Verin Ysslych," Kalina said before the guard could reply. She'd recognize Verin's curly hair anywhere. Verin had been at the head of the pack since this competition started. Whatever had killed him? "What kind of animal makes scratches like those?" she asked Keol, but didn't he need to hear his reply to know that his guess was as good as hers? The claw marks were deep, 1/4 of an inch at least. She crouched beside one and ran her finger along the interior edge. It was jagged, but cut clean into the stone floor. Her brows knotting, she scanned the other claw marks. "There's no blood in these claw marks," she said, twisting her head to look over her shoulder at Keol. He knelt beside her as she pointed to them. "They're clean." "Which means?" She frowned, fighting the chill that ran down her arms. "Whatever did this sharpened its nails before it gutted him." "And why is that important?" She stood, looking up and down the hallway, then squatted again. "It means this thing had time to do that before it attacked him. It could have done it while lying in wait." She shook her head. "Those torches along the wall are almost burned to stubs. There aren't any signs of them being extinguished before the attack. There are no traces of sooty water. If Verin died last night, then those torches were still burning when he died. And look at this hallway. The nearest doorway is 50 feet down, and the nearest corner is a bit farther than that. If those torches were burning, then Verin would have seen whatever it was long before he got to this spot. So why get near it?" she asked, more to herself than anything. "Not if it wasn't an animal, but a person. And what if that person disabled Verin long enough for them to summon this creature?" She pointed to Verin's legs. "Those are clean cuts around his ankles. His tendons were snapped by a knife, to keep him from running." She moved next to the body, taking care not to disturb the wired marks etched into the ground as she lifted Verin's rigid, Cold hand. Look at his fingernails. She swallowed hard. The tips are cracked and shattered. She used her own nail to scrape out the dirt beneath his nails, and smeared it across her palm. See. She held out her hand out for Keol to observe. Dust and bits of stone. She pulled aside Verin's arm, revealing faint lines in the stone beneath. Fingernail marks. He was desperate to get away, to drag himself by his fingertips, if necessary. He was alive the entire time that thing sharpened its claws on the stone while its master watched. So what does that mean? She smiled grimly at him. It means that you're in a lot of trouble. And, as Keol's face paled, Kalina realized with a jolt that perhaps the champion's killer and Elena's mysterious evil force might be one and the same. Seated at the dining table, Kalina flipped through the book. Nothing, nothing, nothing. She scanned page after page for any sign of the two wired marks that had been drawn beside Verin's body. There had to be a connection. She stopped as a map of Erelia appeared. Maps had always interested her. There was something bewitching in knowing one's precise location in relation to others on the earth. She gently traced a finger along the eastern coast. She began in the south, at Banjali, the Ilwe capital, then went up, curving and snaking, all the way to Rifthold. Her finger then traveled through me, then north and inland to Orinth, then back to the sea, to the Sarayan coast, and finally to the very tip of the continent and the North Sea beyond. She stared at Orinth, that city of light and learning, the pearl of Erelia and capital of Terrasen. Her birthplace. Kalina slammed shut the book. Glancing around her room, the assassin let out a long sigh. When she managed to sleep, her dreams were haunted by ancient battles, by swords with eyes, by wired marks that swirled around her head and blinded her with their bright colors. She could see the gleaming armor of fey and mortal warriors, hear the clash of shields and the snarl of vicious beasts, and smell blood and rotting corpses all around her. Carnage trailed in her wake. Adalan's assassin shuddered. "Oh, good. I hoped you'd still be awake," the crown prince said, and Kalina jumped from her seat to find Dorian approaching. He looked tired and a bit ruffled. She opened her mouth, then shook her head. "What are you doing here? It's almost midnight, and I've got a test tomorrow." She couldn't deny having him here was a bit of a relief. The murderer only seemed to attack champions when they were alone. "Have you moved from literature to history?" He surveyed the books on the table. A brief history of modern Erelia he read. Symbols and power. Ilwe culture and customs. He raised an eyebrow. "I read what I like." He slid into the seat beside her, his leg brushing hers. "Is there a connection between all of these?" No. It wasn't quite a lie, though she had hoped for all of them to contain something about wired marks, or what they meant beside a corpse. "I assume you heard about Verin's death." "Of course," he said, a dark expression crossing his handsome face. She was all too aware of how close his leg was, but she couldn't bring herself to shift away. "And you're not at all concerned that so many champions have been brutally murdered at the hands of someone's feral beast?" Dorian leaned in, his eyes fixed on hers. "All of those murders occurred in dark, isolated hallways. You're never without guards, and your chambers are well watched." "I'm not concerned for myself," she said sharply, pulling back a bit. Which wasn't entirely true. "I just think it reflects poorly on your esteemed father to have all of this going on." "When was the last time you bothered to care for the reputation of my esteemed father?" "Since I became his son's champion." "So perhaps you ought to devote some additional resources to solving these murders, before I win this absurd competition just because I'm the last one left alive." "Any more demands?" he asked, still close enough for her lips to graze his if she dared. "I'll let you know if I think of any." Their eyes locked. A slow smile spread across her face. What son of a man was the crown prince? Though she didn't want to admit it, it was nice to have someone around, even if he was a Harvard. She pushed claw marks and brainless corpses from her thoughts. Why are you so disheveled? Has Kaltain been clawing at you? Kaltain? Thankfully, not recently. But what a miserable day it was. The pups are mutts, and, he put his head in his hands. Pups. One of my bitches gave birth to a litter of mongrels. Before, they were too young to tell. But now. Well, I'd hoped for purebreds. Are we speaking of dogs or of women? Which would you prefer? He gave her an impish grin. Oh, hush up, she hissed, and he chuckled. Why, might I ask, are you so disheveled? His smile faltered. Keol told me he took you to see the body. I hope it wasn't too harrowing. Not at all. It's just that I haven't slept well. Me, neither, he admitted. He straightened. Will you play the pianoforte for me? Kalina tapped her foot on the floor, wondering how he had moved on to such a different subject. Of course not. You played beautifully. If I had known someone was spying on me, I wouldn't have played at all. Why is playing so personal for you? He leaned back in his chair. I can't hear or play music without, never mind. No, tell me what you were going to say. Nothing interesting, she said, stacking the books. Does it stir up memories? She eyed him, searching for any sign of mockery. Sometimes. Memories of your parents. He reached to help her stack the remaining books. Kalina stood suddenly. Don't ask such stupid questions. I'm sorry if I pried. She didn't respond. The door in her mind that she kept locked at all times had been cracked open by the question, and now she tried frantically to close it. Seeing his face, seeing him so near to her. The door shut and she turned the key. It's just, he said, oblivious to the battle that had just occurred, it's just that I don't know anything about you. I'm an assassin. Her heartbeat calmed. That's all there is to know. Yes, he said with a sigh. But why is it so wrong for me to want to know more? Like how you became an assassin, and what things were like for you before that. It's not interesting. I wouldn't find it boring. She didn't say anything. Please. One question, and I promise, nothing too sensitive. Her mouth twisted to the side and she looked at the table. What harm was there in a question? She could choose not to reply. Very well. He grinned. I need a moment to think of a good one. She rolled her eyes, but sat down. After a few seconds, he asked, IVH, why do you like music so much? She made a face. You said nothing sensitive. Is it that prying? How different is that from asking why you like to read? No, no. That question is fine. She let out a long breath through her nose and stared at the table. I like music, she said slowly, because when I hear it, I lose myself within myself, if that makes sense. I become empty and full all at once, and I can feel the whole earth rolling around me. When I play, I'm not. For once, I'm not destroying. I'm creating. She chewed on her lip. I used to want to be a healer. Back when I was. Back before this became my profession, when I was almost too young to remember, I wanted to be a healer. She shrugged. Music reminds me of that feeling. She laughed under her breath. I've never told anyone that, she admitted, then saw his smile. Don't mock me. He shook his head, wiping the smile from his lips. I'm just unused to hearing people speak from the heart. Well, yes. I'm not mocking you, she smiled slightly. Now it's my turn. Are there any limitations? No. He tucked his hands behind his head. I'm not nearly as private as you. She made a face as she thought of the question. XVHY, aren't you married yet? Married? I'm 19. Yes, but you're the crown prince. He crossed his arms. She tried not to notice the cut of muscle that shifted just beneath the fabric of his shirt. Ask another question. I want to hear your answer. It must be interesting if you're so ardently resisting. He looked at the window and the snow that swirled beyond. I'm not married, he said softly, because I can't stomach the idea of marrying a woman inferior to me in mind and spirit. It would mean the death of my soul. Marriage is a legal contract, it's not a sacred thing. As crown prince, you should have given up such fanciful notions. I vote if you're ordered to marry for the sake of alliance. Would you start a war because of your romantic ideals? It's not like that. Oh. Your father wouldn't command you to marry some princess in order to strengthen his empire. My father has an army to do that for him. You could easily love some woman on the side. Marriage doesn't mean you can't love other people. His sapphire eyes flashed. You marry the person you love, and none other, he said, and she laughed. You're mocking me. You're laughing in my face. You deserve to be laughed at for such foolish thoughts. I spoke from my soul, you speak only from selfishness. You're remarkably judgmental. What's the point in having a mind if you don't use it to make judgments? What's the point in having a heart if you don't use it to spare others from the harsh judgments of your mind? Oh, well said, Your Highness. He stared at her sullenly. Come now. I didn't wound you that severely. You've attempted to ruin my dreams and ideals. I get enough from Mimatha as it is. You're just being cruel. I'm being practical. There's a difference. And you're the Crown Prince of Adalin. You're in a position where it's possible for you to change Erelia for the better. You could help create a world where true love isn't needed to secure a happy ending. And what sort of world would I need to create for that to happen? A world where men govern themselves. You speak of anarchy and treason. I do not speak of anarchy. Call me a traitor all you like, I've been convicted as an assassin already. He sidled closer to her, and his fingers brushed hers, calloused, warm, and hard. You can't resist the opportunity to respond to everything I say, can you? She felt restless, but at the same time remarkably still. Something was brought to life and laid to sleep in his gaze. Your eyes are very strange, he said. I've never seen any with such a bright ring of gold. If you're attempting to woo me with flattery, I'm afraid it won't work. I was merely observing, I have no agenda. He looked at his hand, still touching hers. Where did you get that ring? She contracted her hand into a fist as she pulled it away from him. The amethyst in her ring glowed in the firelight. It was a gift. From whom? That's none of your concern. He shrugged, though she knew better than to tell him who'd really given it to her. Rather, she knew Keol wouldn't want Dorian to know. I'd like to know who's been giving rings to my champion. The way the collar of his black jacket lay across his neck made her unable to sit still. She wanted to touch him, to trace the line between his tan skin and the golden lining of the fabric. Billiards, she asked, rising to her feet. I could use another lesson. Kalina didn't wait for his answer as she strode toward the gaming room. She very much wanted to stand close to him and have her skin won under his breath. She liked that. Worse than that, she realized, she liked him. Keol watched Purrington at his table in the dining hall. When he had approached the Duke about Verin's death, he hadn't seemed bothered. Keol looked around the cavernous hall. In fact, most of the champion's sponsors went about as usual. Idiots. If Kalina was actually right about it, then whoever was responsible for killing the champions could be among them. But which of the members of the King's Council would be so desperate to win that he'd do such a thing? Keol stretched his legs beneath the table and shifted his attention back to Purrington. He'd seen how the Duke used his size and title to win allies on the King's Council and keep opponents from challenging him. But it wasn't his maneuverings that had captured the interest of the captain of the guard tonight. Rather, it was the moments between the grins and laughter, when a shadow passed across the Duke's face. It wasn't an expression of anger or of disgust, but a shade that clouded his eyes. It was so strange that when Keol had first seen it, he'd extended his dinner just to see if it happened again. A few moments later, it did. Purrington's eyes became dark and his face cleared, as if he saw everything in the world for what it was and found no joy or amusement in it. Keol leaned back in his chair, sipping his water. He knew little of the Duke, and had never entirely trusted him. Neither had Dorian, especially not after all his talk of using Nehemiah as a hostage to get the Ilwa rebels to cooperate. But the Duke was the king's most trusted advisor and had offered no cause for mistrust other than a fierce belief in Adalon's right to conquest. Kaltain Rompia sat a few chairs away. Keol's brows rose slightly. Her eyes were upon Purrington as well, filled not with the longing of a beloved, but with cold contemplation. Keol stretched again, lifting his arms over his head. Where was Dorian? The prince hadn't come to dinner, nor was he in the kennels with the bitch and her pups. His gaze returned to the Duke. There it was, for a moment. Purrington's eyes fell upon the black ring on his left hand and darkened, as if his pupils had expanded to encompass all of each eye. Then it was gone, his eyes returned to normal. Keol looked to Kaltain. Had she noticed the odd change? No, her face remained the same. There was no bewilderment, no surprise. Her look became shallow, as if she were more interested in how his jacket might complement her dress. Keol stretched and rose, finishing his apple as he strode from the dining hall. Strange as it was, he had enough to worry about. The Duke was ambitious, but certainly not a threat to the castle or its inhabitants. But even as the captain of the guard walked to his rooms, he couldn't shake the feeling that Duke Purrington had been watching him. Chapter 31 Someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Kalina knew this long before she opened her eyes, and she eased her hand beneath her pillow, pulling out the makeshift knife she'd crafted of pins, string, and soap. That's unnecessary, a woman said, and Kalina sat upright at the sound of Elena's voice. And would be wholly ineffective. Her blood went cold at the sight of the shimmering spectre of the first queen of Adalon. Though Elena looked fully formed, the edges of her body gleamed as though made from starlight. Her long, silver hair flowed around her beautiful face, and she smiled as Kalina set down her miserably pathetic knife. "Hello, child," the queen said. "What do you want?" Kalina demanded, but kept her voice down. Was she dreaming, or could the guards hear her? She tensed, her legs preparing to leap from the bed, perhaps toward the balcony, since Elena stood between her and the door. "Simply to remind you that you must win this competition." "I already planned to." She'd been woken up for this. "And it's not for you," she added coldly. "I'm doing it for my freedom." "Do you have anything useful to say, or are you just here to bother me? Or maybe you could just tell me more about this evil thing that's hunting the champions down one by one." Elena sighed, lifting her eyes to the ceiling. "I know as little as you." When Kalina's frown didn't disappear, Elena said, "You don't trust me yet." "I understand. But you and I are on the same side, whether you allow yourself to believe it or not." She lowered her gaze to the assassin, pinning her with the intensity of it. "I came here to warn you to keep an eye on your right." "Excuse me." Kalina cocked her head. "What does that mean?" "Look to your right. You'll find the answers there." Kalina looked to her right, but all she saw was the tapestry that concealed the tomb. She opened her mouth to snap a response, but when she looked back at Elena, the queen was gone. At her test the next day, Kalina studied the small table before her and all the goblets it contained. It had been over 2 weeks since Samyun, and while she'd passed yet another test, knife throwing, to her relief, another champion had been found dead just 2 days ago. To say she was getting little sleep these days was an understatement. Even she wasn't searching for an indication of what the wired marks around the corpses had meant. She spent most of the night wide awake, watching her windows and doors, listening for the scrape of claw on stone. The royal guards outside her rooms didn't help. If this beast was capable of gouging marble, it could take down a few men. Brallo stood at the front of the sparring hall, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the 13 remaining competitors standing at 13 individual tables. He glanced at the clock. Kalina looked at it, too. She had 5 minutes left, 5 minutes during which she not only had to identify the poisons in 7 goblets, but arrange them in the order of the most benign to the deadliest. The true test, however, would come at the end of the 5 minutes, when they were to drink from the goblet they deemed the most harmless. If they got the answer wrong, even with antidotes on hand, it would be unpleasant. Kalina rolled her neck and lifted one of the goblets to her nose, sniffing. Sweet, too sweet. She swirled the dessert wine they'd used to conceal the sweetness, but in the bronze goblet, it was difficult to see the color. She dipped her finger into the cup, studying the purple liquid as it dripped off her nail. Definitely belladonna. She looked at the other goblets she'd identified. Hemlock. Bloodroot. Monkshood. Oleander. She shifted the goblets into order, squeezing in belladonna just before the goblet containing a lethal dose of oleander. 3 minutes left. Kalina picked up the penultimate goblet and sniffed. And sniffed again. It didn't smell like anything. She shifted her face away from the table and sniffed the air, hoping to clear her nostrils. When trying perfumes, people sometimes lose their sense of smell after sniffing too many. Ivik was why perfumers usually kept something on site to help clear the scent from the nose. She sniffed the goblet again, and dunked her finger. It smelled like water, looked like water. Perhaps it was just water. She set down the glass and picked up the final goblet. But when she sniffed it, the wine inside didn't have any unusual smell. It seemed fine. She bit her lip and glanced at the clock. 2 minutes left. Some of the other champions were cursing under their breath. Whoever got the order most wrong went home. Kalina sniffed the water goblet again, racing through a list of odorless poisons. None of them could be combined with water, not without coloring it. She picked up the wine goblet, swirling the liquid. Wine could conceal any number of advanced poisons, but which one was it? At the table to the left of her, Nox ran his hands through his dark hair. He had 3 goblets in front of him, the other 4 in line behind them. 90 seconds left. Poisons, poisons, poisons. Her mouth went dry. If she lost, would Elena haunt her from spite? Kalina glanced to the right to find Pelea, the gangly young assassin, watching her. He was down to the same 2 goblets that she struggled with, and she watched as he put the water glass at the very end of the spectrum, the most poisonous, and the wine glass at the other. His eyes flicked to hers, and his chin drooped in a barely detectable nod. He put his hands in his pockets. He was done. Kalina turned to her own goblets before Brallo could catch her. Poisons. That's what Pelea had said during their first test. He was trained in poisons. She glanced at him sidelong. He stood to her right. Look to your right. You'll find the answers there. A chill went down her spine. Elena had been telling the truth. Pelea stared at the clock, watching it count down the seconds until the test was over. But why help her? She moved the water glass to the end of the line, and put the wine glass first. Because aside from her, Kane's favorite champion to torment was Pelea. And because when she'd been in Endovia, the allies she'd made hadn't been the darlings of the overseers, but the ones the overseers had hated most. The outsiders looked out for each other. None of the other champions had bothered to pay attention to Pelea, even BN_Lo, it seemed, had forgotten Pelea's claim that first day. If he'd known, he never would have allowed them to do the test so publicly. Time's up. Make your final order, Brallo said, and Kalina stared at her line of goblets for a moment longer. On the side of the room, Dorian and Keol watched with crossed arms. Had they noticed Pelea's help? Nox cursed colorfully and shoved his remaining glasses into the line, many of the competitors doing the same. Antidotes were on hand in case mistakes were made, and as Brallo began going through the tables, telling the champions to drink, he handed them out frequently. Most of them had assumed the wine with nothing in it was a trap and placed it toward the end of the spectrum. Even Nox wound up chugging a vial of antidote. He'd put Monk's Hood first. And Kane, to her delight, wound up going purple in the face after consuming belladonna. As he guzzled down the antidote, she wished Brallo had somehow run out. So far, no one had won the test. One champion drank the water and was on the ground before Brallo could hand him the antidote. Bloodburn, a horrible, painful poison. Even consuming just a little could cause vivid hallucinations and disorientation. Thankfully, the weapons master forced him to swallow the antidote, though the champion still had to be rushed to the castle infirmary. At last, Brallo stopped at her table to survey her line of goblets. His face revealed nothing as he said, "On with it, then." Kalina glanced at Pelea, whose hazel eyes shone as she lifted the glass of wine to her lips and drank a sip. Nothing. No strange taste, no immediate sensation. Some poisons could take longer to affect you, but Brallo extended a fist to her, and her stomach clenched. Was the antidote inside? But his fingers splayed, and he only clapped her on the back. The right one, just wine, he said, and the champions murmured behind him. He moved on to Pelea, the last champion, and the youth drank the glass of wine. Brallo grinned at him, grasping his shoulder. Another winner. Applause rippled through the sponsors and trainers, and Kalina flashed an appreciative grin in the assassin's direction. He grinned back, going red from his neck to his copper hair. So she'd cheated a little, but she'd won. She could handle sharing the victory with an ally. And, yes, Elena was looking out for her, but that didn't change anything. Even if her path and Elena's demands were now tied closely together, she wouldn't become the king's champion just to serve some ghost's agenda, an agenda that Elena had twice now failed to reveal. Even if Elena had told her how to win the test. Chapter 32. After cutting short their lesson in favor of a stroll, Kalina and Nehemiah walked through the spacious halls of the castle, guards trailing behind them. Whatever Nehemiah thought of the flock of guards that followed Kalina everywhere, she didn't say anything. Despite the fact that Eulimus was a month away, and the final duel 5 days after that, every evening, for an hour before dinner, Kalina and the princess divided their time equally between Ilwe and the common tongue. Kalina had Nehemiah read from her library books, and then forced her to copy letter after letter until they looked flawless. Since they'd begun their lessons, the princess had greatly improved her fluency in the common tongue, though the girls still spoke Ilwe. Perhaps it was for ease and comfort, perhaps it was to see the raised eyebrows and gaping mouths when others overheard them, perhaps it was to keep their conversations private. Whichever reason, the assassin found the language preferable. At least Endovia had taught her something. "You're quiet today," Nehemiah said. "Is something the matter?" Kalina smiled weakly. Something was the matter. She'd slept so poorly the previous night that she'd wished for dawn to arrive early. Another champion was dead. Not to mention, there was still the matter of Elena's commands. "I was up late reading, is all." They entered a part of the castle that Kalina had never seen before. "I sense much worry in you," Nehemiah said suddenly, "and I hear much that you do not say. You never voice any of your troubles, though your eyes betray them." Was she so transparent? "We're friends," Nehemiah said softly. "When you need me, I'll be there." Kalina's throat tightened, and she put a hand on Nehemiah's shoulder. "No one has called me friend in a long time," the assassin said. An inky black crept into the corner of her memory, and she struggled against it. "There are parts of me that I..." She heard it then, the sound that haunted her dreams. Hooves pounding, thunderous hooves. Kalina shook her head and the sound stopped. "Thank you, Nehemiah," she said with sincerity. "You're a true friend." Her heart was raw and trembling, and the darkness faded. Nehemiah suddenly groaned. "The Queen asked me to watch some acting troupe perform one of her favorite plays tonight. Will you go with me? I could use a translator." Kalina frowned. "I'm afraid that you cannot go." Nehemiah's voice was tinted with annoyance, and Kalina gave her friend an apologetic look. "There are certain things that..." Kalina began, but the princess shook her head. "We all have our secrets, though I'm curious why you're so closely watched by that captain and locked in your rooms at night. If I were a fool, I'd say they're afraid of you." The assassin smiled. "Men will always be silly about such things." She thought about what the princess had said, and worry slipped into her stomach. "So are you actually on good terms with the Queen of Adolan? You didn't really make an effort to start off that way." The princess nodded, lifting her chin. "You know that the situation between our countries isn't pleasant right now. While I might have been a little distant with Georgina at first, I realized that it might be in Ilwe's best interest if I make more of an effort. So, I've been speaking with her for some weeks now, hoping to make her aware of how we might improve our relations. I think inviting me tonight is a sign that I might be making some progress." And, Kalina realized, through Georgina, Nehemiah would also get the King of Adolan's ear. Kalina bit her lip, but then quickly smiled. "I'm sure your parents are pleased." They turned down a hall and the sound of barking dogs filled the air. "Where are we?" "The kennels." Nehemiah beamed. "The prince showed me the pups yesterday, though I think he was just looking for an excuse to get out of his mother's court for a while. It was bad enough they were walking together without Keol, but to enter the kennels. Are we allowed to be here?" Nehemiah straightened. "I am Princess of Ilwe," she said. "I can go wherever I please." Kalina followed the princess through a large wooden door. Wrinkling her nose at the sudden smell, the assassin walked past cages and stalls filled with dogs of many different breeds. Some were so large that they came up to her hip, while others had legs the length of her hand with bodies as long as her arm. The breeds were all fascinating and beautiful, but the sleek hounds aroused awe within her breast. Their arched undersides and slender, long legs were full of grace and speed. They did not yap as the other dogs did, but sat perfectly still and watched her with dark, wise eyes. "Are these all hunting dogs?" Kalina asked, but Nehemiah had disappeared. She could hear her voice, and the voice of another, and then saw a hand extended from within a stall to beckon Kalina inside. The assassin hurried to the pen and looked down over the gate. Dorian Harveliard smiled at her as Nehemiah took a seat. "Why, hello, Lady Lillian," he purred, and set aside a brown and gold puppy. "I didn't expect to see you here." Though with Nehemiah's passion for hunting, I can't say I'm surprised she finally dragged you along. Kalina stared at the 4 dogs. "These are the mutts." Dorian picked one up and stroked its head. "Pity, isn't it? I still can't resist their charm." Carefully, watching Nehemiah laugh as 2 dogs leapt upon her and buried her beneath tongues and wagging tails, the assassin opened the pen door and slipped inside. Nehemiah pointed to the corner. "Is that dog sick?" she asked. There was a fifth pup, a bit larger than the others, and its coat was a silky, silvery gold that shimmered in the shadows. It opened its dark eyes, as if it knew it was being spoken about, and watched them. It was a beautiful animal, and had Kalina not known better, she would have thought it purebred. It's not sick, Dorian said. It just has a foul disposition. It won't come near anyone, human or canine. With good reason, Kalina said, stepping over the legs of the crown prince and nearing the fifth pup. Why should it touch someone like you? If it won't respond to humans, then it will have to be killed, Dorian said offhandedly, and a spark went through Kalina. Kill it. Kill it. For what reason? What did it do to you? It won't make a suitable pet, which is what all of these dogs will become. So you'd kill it because of its temperament? It can't help being that way. She looked around. Ivy's its mother. Perhaps it needs her. Its mother only sees them to nurse and for a few hours of socialization. I usually raise these dogs for racing and hunting, not for cuddling. It's cruel to keep it from its mother. The assassin reached into the shadow and scooped the puppy into her arms. She held it against her chest. I won't let you harm it. If its spirit is strange, Nehemiah offered, it would be a burden. A burden to whom? It's nothing to be upset about, Dorian said. Plenty of dogs are painlessly laid to rest each day. I don't see why you would object to that. Well, don't kill this one, she said. Let me keep it, if only so you don't kill it. Dorian observed her. If it upsets you so much, I won't have it killed. I'll arrange for a home, and I'll even ask for your approval before I make a final decision. You'd do that? What's the dog's life to me? If it pleases you, then it shall happen. Her face burned as he rose to his feet, standing close. You promise? He put a hand on his heart. I swear on my crown that the pup shall live. She was suddenly aware of how near to touching they were. Thank you. Nehemiah watched them from the floor, her brows raised, until one of her personal guards appeared at the gate. It's time to go, princess, he said in Ilwe. You must dress for your evening with the queen. The princess stood, pushing past the bouncing puppies. Do you want to walk with me? Nehemiah said in the common tongue to Kalina. Kalina nodded and opened the gate for them. Shutting the gate, she looked back at the crown prince. Well, aren't you coming with us? He slumped down into the pen, and the puppies immediately leapt on him. Perhaps I'll see you later tonight. If you're lucky, Kalina purred, and walked away. She smiled to herself as they strode through the castle. Eventually Nehemiah turned to her. Do you like him? Kalina made a face. Of course not. Why would I? You converse easily. It seems as if you have a connection. A connection. Kalina choked on the word. I just enjoy teasing him. It's not a crime if you consider him handsome. I'll admit I judged him wrong. I thought him to be a pompous, selfish idiot, but he's not so bad. He's a Harverliad. My mother was the daughter of a chief who sought to overthrow my grandfather. We're both silly. It's nothing. He seems to take great interest in you. Kalina's head whipped around, her eyes full of long-forgotten fury that made her belly ache and twist. I would sooner cut out my own heart than love a Harverliad, she snarled. They completed their walk in silence, and when they parted ways, Kalina quickly wished Nehemiah a pleasant evening before striding to her part of the castle. The few guards that followed her remained a respectful distance away, a distance that grew greater each day. Based on Keol's orders. Night had recently fallen, and the sky remained a deep blue, staining the snow piled up on the panes of the windows. She could easily walk right out of the castle, stock up on supplies in Riftfold, and be on a ship to the south by morning. Kalina stopped at a window, leaning in close to the panes. The guards stopped, too, and said nothing as they waited. The coldness from outside seeped in, kissing her face. Would they expect her to go south? Perhaps going north would be the unexpected choice. No one went north in winter unless they had a death wish. Something shifted in the reflection of the window, and she whirled as she beheld the man standing behind her. But Cain didn't smile at her, not in that mocking way. Instead, he panted, his mouth opening and closing like a fish wrenched from water. His dark eyes were wide, and he had a hand around his enormous throat. Hopefully, he was choking to death. "Is something wrong?" she asked sweetly, leaning against the wall. He glanced from side to side, at the guards, at the window, before his eyes snapped to hers. His grip on his throat tightened, as if to silence the words that fought to come out, and the ebony ring on his finger gleamed dully. Even though it should have been impossible, he seemed to have packed on an additional 10 pounds of muscle in the past few days. In fact, every time she saw him, Cain seemed bigger and bigger. Her brows knotted, and she uncrossed her arms. "Cain," she said, but he took off down the hall like a jackrabbit, faster than he should have any ability to run. He peered a few times over his shoulder, not at her, or the confused and murmuring guards, but at something beyond. Kalina waited until the sounds of his fleeing footsteps faded, then hurried back to her own rooms. She sent messages to Nox and Pelea, not explaining why, but just telling them to stay in their chambers that night and not open the door for anyone. Chapter 33. Kaltain pinched her cheeks as she emerged from the dressing room. Her servants sprayed perfume, and the young woman gulped down sugar water before putting her hand on the door. She'd been in the midst of smoking a pipe when Duke Purrington had been announced. She'd fled into the dressing room and changed her clothes, hoping the scent wouldn't linger. If he found out about the opium, she could just blame it on the horrible headaches she'd been having lately. Kaltain passed through her bedroom into the foyer, and then into the sitting room. He looked ready for battle, as always. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying. The world was foggy around the edges, and her body felt heavy. He kissed her hand when she offered it, his lips soggy against her skin. Their eyes met as he looked up from her hand, and a piece of the world slipped away. How far would she go to secure her position at Dorian's side? "I hope I didn't disturb you," he said, releasing her hand. The walls of the room appeared, and then the floor and the ceiling, and she had the distinct feeling that she was trapped in a box, a lovely cage filled with tapestries and cushions. "I was only napping, milord," she said, sitting down. He sniffed, and Kaltain would have felt immensely nervous were it not for the drug curling around her mind. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this unexpected visit?" "I wished to inquire after you. I didn't see you at dinner." Purrington crossed his arms that looked capable of crushing her skull. "I was indisposed." She resisted the urge to rest her too heavy head on the couch. He said something to her, but she found that her ears had stopped hearing. His skin seemed to harden and glaze over, and his eyes became unforgiving marble orbs. Even the thinning hair was frozen in stone. She gaped as the white mouth continued to move, revealing a throat of carved marble. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not feeling well. Shall I fetch you water?" The Duke stood. "Or shall I go?" "No," she said, almost crying out. Her heart twitched. "What I mean is, I'm well enough to enjoy your company, but you must forgive my absent-mindedness." "I wouldn't call you absent-minded, Lady Kaltain," he said, sitting down. "You're one of the cleverest women I've met. His Highness told me the same thing yesterday." Kaltain's spine snapped and straightened. She saw Dorian's face and the crown that sat upon his head. "The prince said that, about me." The Duke put a hand on her knee, stroking it with his thumb. "Of course," then Lady Lillian interrupted before he could say more. Her head spun. "Why was she with him?" "I don't know. I wish it were otherwise. She must do something to stop this. The girl moved fast, too fast for her maneuvering. Lillian had snared the Crown Prince in her net, and now Kaltain must cut him free. Purrington could do it. He could make Lillian disappear and never be found. No, Lillian was a lady, and a man with as much honor as Purrington would never harm one of noble birth. Or would he? Skeletons danced in circles around her head. But what if he thought Lillian weren't a lady? Her headache flared to life with a sudden burst that sucked the air from her lungs. I had the same reaction, she said, rubbing her temple. It's hard to believe someone as disreputable as the Lady Lillian won the heart of the prince. Maybe the headaches would stop once she was at Dorian's side. Perhaps it would do some good if someone spoke to His Highness. Disreputable. I heard from someone that her background is not as pure as it should be. What have you heard? Purrington demanded. Kaltain played with a jewel hanging from her bracelet. I didn't get specifics, but some of the nobility don't believe her to be a worthy companion of anyone in this court. I'd like to learn more about the Lady Lillian, wouldn't you? It's our duty as loyal subjects of the crown to protect our prince from such forces. Indeed it is, the Duke said quietly. Something wild and foreign issued a cry within her, shattering through the pain in her head, and thoughts of poppies and cages faded away. She must do what was necessary to save the crown, and her future. Kalina looked up from an ancient book of wired mark theories as the door creaked open, the hinges squealing loud enough to wake the dead. Her heart skipped a beat, and she tried to appear as casual as possible. But it was not Dorian Harveliard who entered, nor was it a ferocious creature. The door finished opening and Nehemiah, clad in a gold-worked wonder, stood before her. She didn't look at Kalina, nor did she move as she stood in the doorway. Her eyes were upon the floor, and rivers of kohl ran down her cheeks. Nehemiah? Kalina asked, getting to her feet. What happened to the play? Nehemiah's shoulders rose and fell. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing red-rimmed eyes. I didn't know where else to go, she said in Ilwe. Kalina found breathing a bit difficult as she asked, what happened? It was then that Kalina noticed the piece of paper in Nehemiah's hands. It trembled in her grasp. They massacred them, Nehemiah whispered, her eyes wide. She shook her head, as if she were denying her own words. Kalina went still. Who? Nehemiah let out a strangled sob, and a part of Kalina broke at the agony in the sound. A legion of Adalan's army captured 500 Ilwe rebels hiding on the border of Oakwold Forest and the Stone Marshes. Tears dripped from Nehemiah's cheeks and onto her white dress. She crumpled the piece of paper in her hand. My father says they were to go to Kalakala as prisoners of war. But some of the rebels tried to escape on the journey, and Nehemiah breathed hard, fighting to get the words out. And the soldiers killed them all as punishment, even the children. Kalina's dinner rose in her throat. 500, butchered. Kalina became aware of Nehemiah's personal guards standing in the doorway, their eyes gleaming. How many of the rebels had been people that they knew that Nehemiah had somehow helped and protected? What is the point in being a princess of Ilwe if I cannot help my people? Nehemiah said. How can I call myself their princess, when such things happen? I'm so sorry, Kalina whispered. As if those words broke the spell that had been holding the princess in place, Nehemiah rushed into her arms. Her gold jewelry pressed hard into Kalina's skin. Nehemiah wept. Unable to say anything, the assassin simply held her, for as long as it took for the pain to ease. Chapter 34. Kalina sat by a window in her bedroom, watching the snow dance in the night air. Nehemiah had long since returned to her own rooms, tears dried and shoulders squared once more. The clock chimed 11 and Kalina stretched, but then stopped as pain seized her stomach. She bent over, focusing on her breathing, and waited for the cramp to pass. She'd been like this for over an hour now, and she pulled her blanket tighter around herself, the heat of the roaring fire not adequately reaching her seat by the window. Thankfully, Philippa entered, extending a cup of tea. "Here, child," she said. "This will help." She placed it on the table beside the assassin and rested a hand on the armchair. "Pity what happened to those Ilwe rebels," she said quietly enough that no listening ears might hear. "I can't imagine what the princess must be feeling." Kalina felt anger bubble alongside the pain in her stomach. "She's fortunate to have a good friend like you, though." Kalina touched Philippa's hand. "Thank you." She grabbed her teacup and hissed, almost dropping it into her lap as the scalding hot cup bit into her hand. "Careful now." Philippa chuckled. "I didn't know assassins could so clumsy. If you need anything, send word. I've had my fair share of monthly pains." Philippa ruffled Kalina's hair and left. Kalina would have thanked her again, but another wave of cramping took over and she leaned forward as the door closed. Her weight gain over the past 3.5 months had allowed for her monthly cycles to return after near starvation in Endovaya had made them vanish. Kalina groaned. How was she going to train like this? The duel was 4 weeks away. The snowflakes sparkled and shimmered beyond the glass panes of the window, twirling and weaving as they flew to the ground in a waltz that was beyond human comprehension. How could Elena expect her to defeat some evil in this castle, when there was so much more of it out there? What was any of this compared to what was occurring in other kingdoms? As close as Endovaya and Kalakala, even. The door to her bedroom opened, and someone approached. "I heard about Nehemiah." It was Keol. "What are you? Isn't it late for you to be here?" she asked, pulling the blankets tight. Are you sick?" "I'm indisposed." "Because of what happened to those rebels?" "Didn't he get it?" Kalina grimaced. "No. I'm truly feeling unwell." "It makes me sick, too," Keol murmured, glaring at the Falkner. "All of it?" "And after seeing Endovaya." He rubbed his face, as if he could clear away the memories of it. 500 people, he whispered, stunned at what he was admitting. She could only watch. "Listen," he began, and started to pace. "I know that I'm sometimes aloof with you, and I know you complain about it to Dorian, but," he turned to her, "it's a good thing that you befriended the princess, and I appreciate your honesty and unwavering friendship with her. I know there are rumors about Nehemiah's connection to the rebels in Ilwe, but I'd like to think that if my country was conquered, I would stop at nothing to win back my people's freedom, too." She would have replied were it not for the deep pain that wrapped around her lower spine, and the sudden churning in her stomach. "I might," he started, looking at the window. "I might have been wrong." The world began to spin and tilt, and Kalina closed her eyes. She'd always had horrible cramping, usually accompanied by nausea. But she wouldn't vomit. Not right now. "Keol," she began, putting a hand over her mouth as nausea swelled and took control. "It's just that I take great pride in my job," he continued. "Keol," she said again. Oh, she was going to vomit. "And you're Adalan's assassin. But I was wondering if you wanted to," Keol, she warned. As he pivoted, Kalina vomited all over the floor. He made a disgusted noise, jumping back a foot. Tears sprang up as the bitter, sharp taste filled her mouth. She hung over her knees, letting drool and bile spill on the floor. "Are you, by the Wyrd, you're really sick, aren't you?" He called for a servant, helping her from the chair. The world was clearer now. What had he been asking? "Come on. Let's get you into bed." "I'm not ill like that," she groaned. He sat her on the bed, peeling back the blanket. A servant entered, frowning at the mess on the floor, and shouted for help. "Then in what way?" Her face was so hot she thought it would melt onto the floor. "Oh, you idiot. My monthly cycles finally came back." His face suddenly matched hers and he stepped away, dragging a hand through his shone brown hair. "If. Then I'll take my leave," he stammered, and bowed. Kalina raised an eyebrow, and then, despite herself, smiled as he left the room as quickly as his feet could go without running, tripping slightly in the doorway as he staggered into the rooms beyond. Kalina looked at the servants cleaning. "I'm so sorry," she started, but they waved her off. Embarrassed and aching, the assassin climbed farther onto her bed and nestled beneath the covers, hoping sleep would soon come. But sleep wouldn't soon come, and a while later, the door opened again, and someone laughed. "I intercepted Keol, and he informed me of your condition. You'd think a man in his position wouldn't be so squeamish, especially after examining all of those corpses." Kalina opened an eye and frowned as Dorian sat on her bed. "I'm in a state of absolute agony and I can't be bothered." "It can't be that bad," he said, fishing a deck of cards from his jacket. "Ex want to play?" "I already told you that I don't feel well." "You look fine to me." He skillfully shuffled the deck. "Just one game. Don't you pay people to entertain you?" He glowered, breaking the deck. "You should be honored by my company." "I'd be honored if you would leave. For someone who relies on my good graces, you're very bold." "Bold? I've barely begun." Lying on her side, she curled her knees to her chest. He laughed, pocketing the deck of cards. "Your new canine companion is doing well, if you wish to know." She moaned into her pillow. "Go away. I feel like dying." "No fair maiden should die alone," he said, putting a hand on hers. "Shall I read to you in your final moments?" "What story would you like?" She snatched her hand back. "How about the story of the idiotic prince who won't leave the assassin alone?" "Oh. I love that story. It has such a happy ending, too." "Why, the assassin was really feigning her illness in order to get the prince's attention." "Who would have guessed it? Such a clever girl. And the bedroom scene is so lovely it's worth reading through all of their ceaseless banter." "Out. Out. Out. Leave me be and go womanize someone else." She grabbed a book and chucked it at him. He caught it before it broke his nose, and her eyes widened. "I didn't mean, that wasn't an attack. It was a joke. I didn't mean to actually hurt you, Your Highness," she said in a jumble. "I'd hope that Adalan's assassin would choose to attack me in a more dignified manner. At least with a sword or a knife, through preferably not in the back." She clutched her belly and bent over. Sometimes she hated being a woman. "It's Dorian, by the way." "Not Your Highness." "Very well. Say it." "Say what?" "Say my name." "Say, very well, Dorian." She rolled her eyes. "If it pleases your magnanimous holiness, I shall call you by your first name." "Magnanimous holiness. Oh, I like that one." A ghost of a smile appeared on her face, and Dorian looked down at the book. "This isn't one of the books that I sent you. I don't even own books like these." She laughed weakly and took the tea from the servant as she approached. "Of course you don't, Dorian. I had the maid send for a copy today." "Sunset's Passions," he read, and opened the book to a random page to read aloud. His hands gently caressed her ivory, silky beard. His eyes widened. "By the Wyrd. Do you actually read this rubbish? What happened to symbols and power and Eelware customs and culture?" She finished her drink, the ginger tea easing her stomach. "You may borrow it when I'm done. If you read it, your literary experience will be complete." And she added with a coy smile, "It will give you some creative ideas of things to do with your lady friends." He hissed through his teeth. "I will not read this." She took the book from his hands, leaning back. Then I suppose you're just like Keol. Keol, he asked, falling into the trap. You asked Keol to read this. He refused, of course she lied. He said it wasn't right for him to read this sort of material if I gave it to him. Dorian snatched the book from her hands. Give me that, you demon woman. I'll not have you matching us against each other. He glanced once more at the novel, then turned it over, concealing the title. She smiled, and resumed watching the falling snow. It was blisteringly cold now, and even the fire could not warm the blasts of wind that crept through the cracks of her balcony doors. She felt Dorian watching her, and not in the cautious way that Keol sometimes watched her. Rather, Dorian just seemed to be watching her because he enjoyed watching her and she enjoyed watching him. Dorian didn't realize he'd been transfixed by her until she straightened and demanded, "What are you staring at?" "You're beautiful," Dorian said before he could think. "Don't be stupid." "Did I offend you?" His blood pumped through him in a strange rhythm. "No," she said, and quickly faced the window. Dorian watched her face turn redder and redder. He'd never known an attractive woman for so long without courting her, save for Kaltain. And he couldn't deny that he was aching to learn what Kalina's lips felt like, what her bare skin smelled like, how she'd react to the touch of his fingers along her body. The week surrounding Ulimus was a time of relaxation, a time to celebrate the carnal pleasures that kept one warm on a winter's night. Women wore their hair down, some even refused to don a corset. It was a holiday to feast on the fruits of the harvest and those of the flesh. Naturally, he looked forward to it every year. But now he had a sinking feeling in his stomach. How could he celebrate when word had just arrived of what his father's soldiers had done to those Ilwa rebels? They hadn't spared a single life. 500 people, all dead. How could he ever look Nehemiah in the face again? And how could he someday rule a country whose soldiers had been trained to have so little compassion for human life? Dorian's mouth went dry. Kalina was from Terrasen, another conquered country, and his father's first conquest. It was a miracle Kalina bothered to acknowledge his existence, or perhaps she'd spent so long in Adalan that she'd stopped caring. Somehow, Dorian didn't think that was the case, not when she had the 3 giant scars on her back to forever remind her of his father's brutality. "Is there something the matter?" she asked. Cautiously, curiously. As if she cared. He took a deep breath and walked to the window, unable to look at her. The glass was cold beneath his hand, and he watched the snowflakes come crashing down to earth. "You must hate me," he murmured, "hate me and my clan for our frivolity and mindlessness when so many horrible things are going on outside of this city. I heard about those butchered rebels, and I'm ashamed," he said, leaning his head against the window. He heard her rise and then slump into a chair. The words came out in a river, one flowing after the other, and he couldn't stop himself from speaking. "I understand why you have such ease when killing my kind. And I don't blame you for it, Dorian," she said gently. The world outside the castle was dark. "I know you'll never tell me," he continued, voicing what he had wanted to say for some time. "But I know something terrible happened to you when you were young, something perhaps of my father's own doing. You have a right to hate Adalan for seizing control of Terrasen as it did for taking all of the countries, and the country of your friend." He swallowed, his eyes stinging. "You won't believe me. But I don't want to be a pan of that. I can't call myself a man when I allow my father to encourage such unforgivable atrocities. Yet even if I pleaded for clemency on behalf of the conquered kingdoms, he wouldn't listen. Not in this world. This is the world where I only picked you to be my champion because I knew it would annoy my father." She shook her head, but he kept going. "But if I had refused to sponsor a champion, my father would have seen it as a sign of dissent, and I'm not yet enough of a man to stand against him like that. So I chose Adalan's assassin to be my champion, because the choice of my champion was the only choice I had. Yes, it was all clear now. Life shouldn't be like this, he said, their eyes meeting as he gestured at the room. And the world shouldn't be like this. The assassin was silent, listening to the throbbing of her heart before she spoke. I don't hate you, she said in little more than a whisper. He dropped into the chair across from her and put his head in a hand. He seemed remarkably lonely. And I don't think you're like them. I'm sorry if I've hurt you. I'm joking most of the time. Hurt me, he said. You haven't hung me. You've made things a little more entertaining. She cocked her head. Just a little. Maybe a tad more than that. He stretched out his legs. Ah, if only you could come to the Ulimus ball with me. Be grateful you can't attend. Why can't I attend? And what's the Ulimus ball? He groaned. Nothing all that special. Just a masked ball that happens to be on Ulimus. And I think you know exactly why you can't come. You and Keol really delight in ruining any fun I might have, don't you? I like attending parties. When you're my father's champion, you can attend all the balls you want. She made a face. He wanted to tell her then that if he could, he would have asked her to go with him, that he wanted to spend time with her, that he thought of her even when they were apart, but he knew she would have laughed. The clock chimed midnight. I should probably go, he said, stretching his arms. I have a day of council meetings to look forward to tomorrow, and I don't think Duke Purrington will be pleased if I'm half asleep for all of them. Kalina smirked. Be sure to give the Duke my warmest regards. There was no way she'd forgotten how the Duke had treated her that first day in Endovia. Dorian hadn't forgotten it, either. And the thought of the Duke treating her like that again made him burn with cold rage. Without thinking, he leaned down and kissed her cheek. She stiffened as his mouth touched her skin, and though the kiss was brief, he breathed in the scent of her. Pulling away was surprisingly hard. Rest well, Kalina, he said. Good night, Dorian. As he left, he wondered why she suddenly looked so sad, and why she'd pronounced his name not with tenderness, but with resignation. Kalina stared at the moonlight as it streamed across the ceiling. A masked ball on Ulimus. Even if it was the most corrupt and ostentatious town in Erelia, it sounded dreadfully romantic. And of course, she wasn't allowed to go. She let out a long sigh through her nose and tucked her hands beneath her head. Was that what Keol had wanted to ask her before she vomited, a true invitation to the ball? She shook her head. No. The last thing he'd ever do would be to invite her to a royal ball. Besides, both of them had more important things to worry about. Like whoever was killing the champions. Perhaps she should have sent word to him about Kane's strange behavior earlier that afternoon. Kalina closed her eyes and smiled. She could think of no nicer Ulimus gift than for Kane to be found dead the next morning. Still, as the clock marked the passing hours, Kalina kept her vigil waiting, wondering what truly lurked in the castle, and unable to stop thinking of those 500 dead Ilwa rebels, buried in some unmarked grave. Chapter 35. The next evening, Keol Westfall stood on the second floor of the castle, looking over the courtyard. Below him, two figures slowly wove through the hedges. Kalina's white cloak made her easy to spot, and Dorian could always be noticed by the empty circle of space around him. He should be down there, a foot behind, watching them, making sure she didn't seize Dorian and use him to escape. Logic and years of experience screamed at him to be with them, even though 6 guards trailed them. She was deceitful, cunning, vicious. But he couldn't make his feet move. With each day, he felt the barriers melting. He let them melt. Because of her genuine laugh, because he caught her one afternoon sleeping with her face in the middle of a book, Because he knew that she would win. She was a criminal, a prodigy at killing, a queen of the underworld, and yet she was just a girl, sent at 17 to Endovia. It made him sick every time he thought about it. He'd been training with the guards at 17, but he'd still lived here, still had a roof over his head and good food and friends. Dorian had been in the middle of courting Rosamund when he was that age, not caring about anything. But she, at 17, had gone to a death camp. And survived. He wasn't sure if he could survive Endovia, let alone during the winter months. He'd never been whipped, never seen anyone die. He'd never been cold and starving. Kalina laughed at something Dorian said. She'd survived Endovia, and yet could still laugh while it terrified him to see her down there, a hand's breadth from Dorian's unprotected throat. What terrified him even more was that he trusted her. And he didn't know what that meant about himself. Kalina walked between the hedges, and couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. They walked closely, but not close enough to touch. Dorian had found her just moments after dinner and invited her for a walk. In fact, he'd showed up so quickly after the servants cleared away her food that she might have thought he'd been waiting outside. Of course, it was due entirely to the cold that she longed to link arms with him and absorb his warmth. The white, fur-lined cloak did little to keep the frigid air from freezing all of her. She could only imagine how Nehemiah would react to such temperatures. But after learning about the fate of those rebels, the princess was spending most of her time in her rooms, and had declined Kalina's repeated offers to go for walks. It had been over 3 weeks since her last encounter with Elena, and she hadn't seen or heard her at all, despite the 3 tests she'd had, the most exciting of which being an obstacle course, which she passed with only a few minor scratches and bruises. Unfortunately, Pelea hadn't done so well, and had been sent home at long last. But he'd been lucky, 3 other competitors had died. All found in forgotten hallways, all mutilated beyond recognition. Even Kalina had taken to jumping at every strange sound. There were only 6 of them left now, Kane, Grave, Knox, a soldier, and Renault, a vicious mercenary who'd stepped up to replace Verin as Kane's right-hand man. Not surprisingly, Renault's favorite new activity was taunting Kalina. She shoved thoughts of the murders aside as they strode past a fountain, and she caught Dorian giving her an admiring glance from the corner of his eye. Of course, she hadn't been thinking of Dorian when she chose such a fine lavender gown to wear tonight, or when she made sure her hair was so carefully arranged, or that her white gloves were spotless. "What to do now?" Dorian said. "We've walked twice around the garden. Don't you have princely duties to attend to?" Kalina winced as a gust of icy wind blew back her hood and froze her ears. When she recovered the hood, she found Dorian staring at her throat. "Vivat?" she asked, pulling her cloak tightly around her. "You always wear that necklace," he said. "Is it another gift?" Though she wore gloves, he glanced at her hand, where the amethyst ring always sat, and the spark died from his eyes. "No." She covered the amulet with her hand. "I found it in my jewelry box and liked the look of it, you insufferably territorial man. It's very old looking. Been robbing the royal coffer, have you?" He winked, but she didn't feel any warmth behind it. "No," she repeated sharply. Even though a necklace wouldn't protect her from the murderer, and even though Elena had some agenda she was being cagey about, Kalina wouldn't take it off. Its presence somehow comforted her in the long hours she sat up, watching her door. He continued staring at her hand until she lowered it from her throat. "Hair studded the necklace. When I was a boy, I used to read tales about the dawn of Adalon. Gavin was my hero. I must have read every legend regarding the war with Irowen. How can he be that smart? He can't have figured it out so quickly." She tried her best to look innocently interested. "And Elena, first queen of Adalon, had a magical amulet. In the battle with the Dark Lord, Gavin and Elena found themselves defenseless against him. He was about to kill the princess when a spirit appeared and gave her the necklace. And when she put it on, Irulan couldn't harm her. She saw the Dark Lord for what he was and called him by his true name. It surprised him so much that he became distracted, and Gavin slew him. Dorian looked to the ground. They called her necklace the Eye of Elena. It's been lost for centuries. How strange it was to hear Dorian, son of the man who had banished and outlawed all traces of magic, talking about powerful amulets. Still, she laughed as best she could. And you think this trinket is the eye? I think it'd be dust by now. I suppose not, he said, and vigorously rubbed his arms for warmth. But I've seen a few illustrations of the eye, and your necklace looks like it. Perhaps it's a replica. Perhaps. She quickly found another subject. When's your brother arriving? He looked skyward. I'm lucky. We received a letter this morning that snows in the mountains prevented Holin from coming home. He's stuck at school until after his spring term, and he's beside himself. Your poor mother, Kalina said, half smiling. She'll probably send servants to deliver his Eulimus presents, regardless of the storm. Kalina didn't hear him, and though they talked for a good hour afterward meandering through the grounds, she couldn't get her heart to calm. Elena had to have known someone would recognize her amulet, and if this was the real thing, the king could kill her on the spot for wearing not only an heirloom of his house, but something of power. Yet again, she could only wonder what Elena's motives actually were. Kalina glanced from her book to the tapestry on the wall. The chest of drawers remained where she'd shoved it in front of the passageway. She shook her head and returned to her book. Though she scanned the lines, none of the words registered. What did Elena want with her? Dead queens usually didn't come back to give orders to the living. Kalina clenched her book. It wasn't like she wasn't fulfilling Elena's command to win, either. She would have fought this hard to become the king's champion anyway. And as for finding and defeating the evil in the castle, well, now that it seemed tied to who was murdering the champions, how could she not try to figure out where it was coming from? A door shut somewhere inside her rooms, and Kalina jumped, the book flying from her hands. She grabbed the brass candlestick beside her bed, ready to leap off the mattress, but lowered it as Philippa's humming filtered through the doors to her bedroom. She groaned as she climbed out of the warmth of her bed to retrieve her book. It had fallen under the bed, and Kalina knelt upon the icy floor, straining to reach the book. She couldn't feel it anywhere, so she grabbed the candle. She saw the book immediately, tucked against the back wall, but as her fingers grappled onto the cover, a glimmer of candlelight traced a white line across the floor beneath her bed. Kalina yanked the book back to her and stood with a jolt. Her hands trembled as she pushed the bed out of position, her feet slipping on the half-frozen floor. It moved slowly, but eventually, she had shifted it enough to see what had been sketched on the floor beneath. Everything inside of her turned to ice. Wired marks. Dozens of wired marks had been drawn onto the floor with chalk. They formed a giant spiral, with a large mark in its center. Kalina stumbled back, slamming into her dresser. What was this? She ran a shaking hand through her hair, staring at the center mark. She'd seen that mark. It had been etched on one side of Verin's body. Her stomach rising in her throat, she rushed to her nightstand and grabbed the pitcher of water atop it. Without a thought, she tossed the water onto the marks, then raced to her bathing chamber to draw more water. When the water had finished loosening the chalk, she took a towel and scrubbed the floor until her back ached and her legs and hands were frozen. Then, only then, did she throw on a pair of pants and a tunic and head out the door. Thankfully, the guards didn't say anything when she asked them to escort her to the library at midnight. They remained in the main room of the library as she set off through the stacks, heading toward the musty, forgotten alcove where she'd found the majority of the books on the wired marks. She couldn't walk fast enough, and kept looking over her shoulder. Was she next? What did any of it mean? She wrung her fingers. She rounded a corner, not 10 stacks from the alcove, and came to a halt. Nehemiah, seated at a small desk, stared at her with wide eyes. Kalina put a hand on her racing heart. "Damn," she said. "You gave me a fright." Nehemiah smiled, but not very well. Kalina cocked her head as she approached the table. "What are you doing here?" Nehemiah demanded in Ilwe. "I couldn't sleep." She shifted her eyes to the princess's book. That wasn't the book they used during their lessons. No, it was a thick, aging book, crammed with dense lines of text. "What are you reading?" Nehemiah slammed the book shut and stood. "Nothing." Kalina observed her face. Her lips were pursed, and the princess lifted her chin. "I thought you couldn't read at that level yet." Nehemiah tucked the book into the crook of her arm. "Then you're like every ignorant fool in this castle, Lillian," she said with perfect pronunciation in the common tongue. Not giving her a chance to reply, the princess strode away. Kalina watched her go. It didn't make sense. Nehemiah couldn't read books that advanced, not when she still stumbled through lines of text. And Nehemiah never spoke with that kind of flawless accent, and in the shadows behind the desk, a piece of paper had fallen between the wood and the stone wall. Easing it out, Kalina unfolded the crumpled paper. She whirled around, to the direction where Nehemiah had disappeared. Her throat constricting, Kalina tucked the piece of paper into her pocket and hurried back toward the great room, the wired mark drawn on the paper burning a hole in her clothing. Kalina rushed down a staircase, then strode along a hallway lined with books. No, Nehemiah couldn't have played her like that. Nehemiah wouldn't have lied day after day about how little she knew. Nehemiah had been the one to tell her that the etchings in the garden were wired marks. She knew what they were. She'd warned her to stay away from the wired marks, again and again. Because Nehemiah was her friend, because Nehemiah had wept when her people had been murdered, because she'd come to her for comfort. But Nehemiah came from a conquered kingdom. And the king of Adalan had ripped the crown off her father's head and stripped his title from him. And the people of Ilwe were being kidnapped in the night and sold into slavery, right along with the rebels that rumor claimed Nehemiah supported so fiercely. And 500 Ilwe citizens had just been butchered. Kalina's eyes stung as she spotted the guards loitering in armchairs in the great room. Nehemiah had every reason to deceive them, to plot against them. To tear apart this stupid competition and send everyone into a tizzy. Who better to target than the criminals living here? No one would miss them, but the fear would seep into the castle. But why would Nehemiah plot against her? Chapter 36 days passed without seeing Nehemiah, and Kalina kept her mouth shut about the incident to Keol or Dorian or anyone who visited her chambers. She couldn't confront Nehemiah, not without more concrete proof, not without ruining everything. So she spent her spare time researching the wired marks, desperate for a way to decipher them, to find those symbols, to learn what it all meant, and how it connected to the killer and the killer's beast. Amidst her worrying, another test passed without incident or embarrassment, though she couldn't say the same for the soldier who'd been sent home, and she kept up her intense training with Keol and the other champions. There were 5 of them left now. The final test was 3 days away, and the duel 2 days after that. Kalina awoke on Eulimus morning and relished the silence. There was something inherently peaceful about the day, despite the darkness of her encounter with Nehemiah. For the moment, the whole castle had quieted to hear the falling snow. Frost laced each window open, a fire already crackled in the fireplace, and shadows of snowflakes drifted across the floor. It was as peaceful and lovely a winter morning as she could imagine. She wouldn't ruin it with thoughts of Nehemiah, or of the duel, or of the ball she wasn't allowed to attend tonight. No, it was Eulimus morning, and she would be happy. It didn't feel like a holiday to celebrate the darkness that gave birth to the spring light, nor did it feel like a holiday to celebrate the birth of the goddess's firstborn son. It was simply a day when people were more courteous, looked twice at a beggar in the street, remembered that love was a living thing. Kalina smiled and rolled over. But something got in her way. It was crinkly and harsh against her face, and had the distinct odor of candy. A large paper bag sat on a pillow, and she found that it was filled with all sorts of confectionery goodies. There was no note, not even a name scribbled on the bag. With a shrug and glowing eyes, Kalina pulled out a handful of sweets. Oh, how she adored candy! Kalina issued a jolly laugh and crammed some of the candy into her mouth. One by one, she chewed through the assortment, and she closed her eyes and breathed in deeply as she tasted all of the flavors and textures. When she finally stopped chewing, her jaw ached. She emptied the contents of the bag onto the bed, ignoring the dunes of sugar that poured out with it, and surveyed the land of goodness before her. All of her favorites were there: chocolate-covered gummies, chocolate almond bark, berry-shaped chews, gem-shaped hard sugar, peanut brittle, plain brittle, sugarless, frosted red licorice, and, most importantly, chocolate. She popped a hazelnut truffle into her mouth. "Someone," she said in between chews, "is very good to me." She paused to examine the bag again. Who had sent it? Maybe Dorian. Certainly not Nehemiah or Keol. Nor the frost fairies that delivered presents to good children. They'd stopped coming to her when she'd first drawn blood from another human being. Maybe Nox. He liked her well enough. "Miss Kalina!" Philippa exclaimed from the doorway, gaping. "Happy Eulimus, Philippa," she said. "Care for a candy?" Philippa stormed toward Kalina. "Happy Eulimus indeed. Look at this bed. Look at this mess." Kalina winced. "Your teeth are red," Philippa cried. She reached for the hand mirror that Kalina kept by her bed and held it for the assassin to see. Sure enough, her teeth were tinged with crimson. She ran her tongue over her teeth, then tried to brush away the stains with a finger. They remained. "Damn those sugar suckers!" "Yes," Philippa snapped. "And that's chocolate all over your mouth. Even my grandson doesn't eat his candy like this." Kalina laughed. "You have a grandson?" "Yes, and he can eat his food without getting it on the bed, on his teeth, and on his face." Kalina pushed back the covers, sugar spraying into the air. "Have a candy, Philippa. It's 7 in the morning." Philippa swept the sugar into her cupped palm. "You'll make yourself sick." "Sick? Who can get sick from candy?" Kalina made a face and exposed her crimson teeth. "You look like a demon," said Philippa. "Just don't open your mouth and no one will notice." "You and I both know that's not possible." To her surprise, Philippa laughed. "Happy Eulimus, Kalina," she said. Hearing Philippa call her by her name sent an unexpected burst of pleasure through her. "Come," the servant clucked. "Let's get you dressed, the ceremony begins at 9. Philippa bustled toward the dressing room, and Kalina watched her go. Her heart was big and as red as her teeth. There was good in people, deep down, there was always a shred of good. There had to be. Kalina emerged a while later, clad in a solemn-looking green dress that Philippa had deemed the only appropriate gown for temple attendance. Kalina's teeth were, of course, still red, and now she felt queasy as she stared at the bag of candy. However, she quickly forgot about her sickness when she saw Dorian Harveliard sitting at the table in her bedroom with crossed legs. He wore a beautiful white and gold jacket. "Are you my present, or is there something in that basket at your feet?" she asked. "If you'd like to unwrap me," he said, lifting the large wicker basket onto the table, "we still have an hour until the temple service." She laughed. "Happy Eulimus, Dorian. And to you as well. I can see that. Are your teeth red? She clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head in violent protestation. He grabbed her nose and pinched it closed, and try as she might, she could not dislodge his fingers. She opened her mouth, and he burst into laughter. Been eating candies, have you? You sent those? She kept her mouth closed as much as possible. Of course. He picked up the brown bag of candy on the table. What's your? He trailed off as he weighed the bag in his hands. Didn't I give you 3 pounds of candy? She smiled impishly. You ate half the bag. Was I supposed to save it? I would have liked some. You never told me that. Because I didn't expect you to consume all of it before breakfast. She snatched the bag from him and put it on the table. Well, that just shows poor judgment on your pan, doesn't it? Dorian opened his mouth to reply, but the bag of candy tipped over and spilled across the table. Kalina turned just in time to see the slender golden snout protruding from the basket, inching toward the candy. What is that? She asked flatly. Dorian grinned. A Eulimus present for you. The assassin flipped back the lid of the basket. The nose instantly shot inward, and Kalina found the strange golden-haired pup quivering in a corner with a red bow around her neck. Oh, puppy, she crooned, and petted her. The dog trembled, and she glared at Dorian over her shoulder. What did you do, you buffoon? She hissed. Dorian threw his hands in the air. It's a gift. I almost lost my arm, and more important parts, trying to put that bow on, and then she howled all the way up here. Kalina looked piteously at the dog, which was now licking the sugar off her fingers. What am I going to do with her? You couldn't find an owner, so you decided to give her to me. No, he said. Well, yes. But, she didn't seem so frightened when you were around, and I remembered how my hounds followed you when we traveled from Endovia. Perhaps she'll trust you enough to become adapted to humans. Some people have those kinds of gifts. She raised an eyebrow as he paced. It's a lousy present, I know. I should have gotten you something better. The dog peered up at Kalina. Her eyes were a golden brown color, like molten caramel. She seemed to be waiting for a blow to fall. She was a beautiful thing, and her huge paws hinted that she might someday grow large and swift. A slight smile spread on Kalina's lips. The dog swished her tail, once, then another time. She's yours, Dorian said, if you want her. What shall I do with her if I'm sent back to Endovia? I'll worry about that. Kalina stroked her folded velvet soft ears, then ventured low enough to scratch her chin. The pup's tail wagged in earnest. Yes, there was life in her. So you don't want her, he muttered. Of course I want her, Kalina said, then realized what the implications would be. But I want her trained. I don't want her urinating on everything and chewing on furniture and shoes and books. And I want her to sit when I tell her to, and lay down and roll over and whatever it is that dogs do. And I want her to run with the other dogs when they're practicing. I want her to put those long legs to use. Dorian crossed his N's as Kalina scooped up the dog. That's a long list of demands. Perhaps I should have bought you jewelry after all. When I'm training, she kissed the pup's soft head, and the dog nestled her cold nose against Kalina's neck. I want her in the kennels, training as well. When I return in the afternoon, she may be brought to me. I'll keep her in the night. Kalina held the dog at eye level. The dog kicked her legs in the air. If you ruin any of my shoes, she said to the pup, I'll turn you into a pair of slippers. Understood. The dog stared at her, her wrinkled brow lifting, and Kalina smiled and set her down on the FLCH. She began sniffing about, though she stayed far from Dorian, and she soon disappeared beneath the bed. The assassin lifted the dust ruffle to peer underneath. Thankfully, the wired marks had been washed away entirely. The dog continued her exploration, sniffing everywhere. "I'll have to think of a name for you," she said to her, and then stood. "Thank you," she said to Dorian. "It's a lovely gift." He was kind, unnaturally kind, for someone of his upbringing. He had a heart, she realized, and a conscience. He was different from the others. Timidly, almost clumsily, the assassin over to the crown prince and kissed him on the cheek. His skin was surprisingly hot, and she wondered if she'd kissed him properly as she pulled away and found his eyes bright and wide. Had she been sloppy? Too wet? Were her lips sticky from the candy? She hoped he wouldn't wipe his cheek. "I'm sorry I don't have a present for you," she said. I didn't expect you to." He blushed madly and glanced at the clock. "I have to go. I'll see you at the ceremony, or perhaps tonight after the ball. I'll try to get away as early as I can. Though I bet that without you there, Nehemiah will probably do the same, so it won't look so bad if I leave early, too." She'd never seen him babble like this. "Enjoy yourself," she said as he took a step back and almost crashed into the table. "I'll see you tonight," then he said. "After the ball." She hid her smile behind a hand. Had her kiss thrown him into such a tizzy? "Goodbye, Kalina." He looked back when he reached the door. She smiled at him, flashing her red teeth, and he laughed before he bowed and disappeared. Alone in her rooms, Kalina was about to see what her new companion was up to when the thought struck her: Nehemiah would be at the ball. It was a simple enough thought at first, but then worse thoughts followed it. Kalina began pacing. If Nehemiah were truly somehow behind the champion's murders, and worse, had some feral beast at her command to destroy them, and also just learned about the massacre of her people, then what better place to punish Adalan than at the ball, where so many of its royals would be celebrating and unguarded? It was irrational, Kalina knew. But what if Nehemiah unleashed whatever creature she controlled at the ball? Fine, she wouldn't mind if Kaltain and Purrington met horrible deaths, but Dorian would be there. And Keol. Kalina strode into her bedroom, wringing her fingers. She couldn't warn Keol, because if she were wrong, then it would ruin not just her friendship with Nehemiah, but also the princess's efforts at diplomacy. But she couldn't just do nothing. Oh, she shouldn't even be thinking this. But she'd seen friends do terrible things before, and it had become safer for her to believe the worst. She'd witnessed firsthand how far a need for revenge could drive someone. Perhaps Nehemiah wouldn't do anything, perhaps she was just being paranoid and ridiculous. But if something happened tonight, Kalina opened the doors to her dressing room, surveying the glittering gowns hanging along the walls. Keol would be beyond furious if she infiltrated the ball, but she could handle it. She could handle it if he decided to throw her in the dungeons for a little while, too. Because somehow, the thought of him getting hurt, or worse, made her willing to risk just about anything. "Will you not even smile on Eulimus?" she asked Keol as they walked out of the castle and toward the glass temple at the center of the eastern garden. "If my teeth were crimson, I wouldn't be smiling at all," he said. "Be content with an occasional grimace." She flashed her teeth at him, then closed her mouth as several courtiers strode past, servants in tow. "I'm surprised you're not complaining more." Complaining about what? Why did Keol never joke with her as Dorian did? Perhaps he truly didn't find her attractive. The possibility of it stung more than she would have liked. About not going to the ball tonight. He glanced sidelong at her. He couldn't know what she was planning. Philippa had promised to keep it a secret, promised not to ask questions when Kalina requested she find a gown and matching mask. "Well, apparently you still don't trust me enough." She meant to sound sassy, but couldn't keep the snap from her tone. She couldn't waste her time worrying about someone who clearly had no interest in her beyond the ridiculous competition. Keol snorted, though a hint of a smile appeared on his lips. At least the Crown Prince never made her feel stupid or rotten. Keol just provoked her, though he had his good side, too. And she had no idea when she'd stopped loathing him so much. Still, she knew he wouldn't be pleased when she appeared at the ball tonight. Mask or no mask, Keol would know it was her. She just hoped he wouldn't punish her too severely. Chapter 37. Seated in a pew in the rear of the spacious temple, Kalina kept her mouth closed so tightly that it hurt. Her teeth were still red, she didn't need anyone else noticing. The temple was a beautiful space, built entirely from glass. The limestone covering the floor was all that remained of the original stone temple, which the king of Adalan had destroyed when he decided to replace it with the glass structure. 2 columns of about 100 rosewood pews stretched beneath a vaulted glass ceiling that let in so much light that no candles were needed during the day. Snow lay piled upon the translucent roof, casting patterns of sunshine throughout. As the walls were also glass, the stained windows above the altar appeared to hover in midair. She stood to peer over the heads of those sitting in front of her. Dorian and the Queen sat in the first pew, a row of guards immediately behind. The Duke and Kaltain sat on the other side of the aisle, and behind them were Nehemiah and several others she didn't recognize. She didn't Spinox, or the other remaining champions, or Cain. They'd let her come to this, but not to the ball. Sit down, Keol growled, pulling at her green gown. She made a face and dropped onto the cushioned bench. Several people stared at her. They wore gowns and jackets so elaborate that she wondered if the ball had been moved to lunchtime. The High Priestess walked onto the stone platform and raised her hands above her head. The folds of her midnight blue gossamer robe fell around her, and her white hair was long and unbound. An 8-pointed star was tattooed upon her brow in a shade of blue that matched her gown, its sharp lines extending to her hairline. Welcome all, and may the blessings of the goddess and all her gods be upon you. Her voice echoed across the chamber to reach even those in the back. Kalina stifled a yawn. She respected the gods, if they existed, and when it suited her to ask for their assistance, but religious ceremonies were brutal. It had been years and years since she'd attended anything of this sort, and as the High Priestess lowered her arms and stared at the crowd, the assassin shifted in her seat. It would be the usual prayers, then the Eulimus prayers, then the sermon, then the songs, and then the procession of the gods. You're squirming already, Keol said under his breath. What time is it? She whispered, and he pinched her arm. Today, the priestess said, is the day on which we celebrate the end and the beginning of the great cycle. Today is the day on which the great goddess gave birth to her firstborn, Lumas, Lord of the Gods. With his birth, love was brought into Erelia, and it banished the chaos that arose from the gates of the Wyrd. A weight pressed on her eyelids. She had woken up so early, and slept so little after that encounter with Nehemiah. Unable to stop, Kalina wandered into the land of sleep. Get up, Keol snarled in her ear. Now. She sat up with a jolt, the world bright and foggy. Several lesser nobles in her pew laughed silently. She gave Keol an apologetic look and turned her gaze to the altar. The High Priestess had finished her sermon, and the songs of Eulimus were over. She only had to sit through the procession of the gods, and then she would be free. How long was I asleep? She whispered. He didn't respond. How long was I asleep? She asked again, and noticed a hint of red in his cheeks. You were asleep, too. Until you began drooling on my shoulder. Such a self-righteous young man, she cooed, and he poked her leg. Pay attention. A choir of priestesses stepped off the platform. Kalina yawned, but nodded with the rest of the congregation as the choir gave their blessings. An organ sounded, and everyone leaned to stare down the aisle for the procession of the gods. The sound of pattering footsteps filled the temple, and the congregation stood. Each blindfolded child was no more than 10 years old, and though they looked rather foolish dressed in the costumes of the gods, there was something charming about it. Every year, 9 children were chosen. If a child stopped before you, you received the blessings of the god and the small gift the child carried as a symbol of the god's favor. Foreigner, god of war, stopped at the front row near Dorian, but then moved to the right, across the aisle, to give the miniature silver sword to Duke Parrington. Not surprising. Clad in glistening wings, Lumas, god of love, strode past her. She crossed her arms. What a foolish tradition. Diana, goddess of the hunt and maidens, approached. Kalina shifted from one foot to the other, wishing she had and demanded that Keol give her the aisle seat. To her dread and dismay, the girl stopped before her and removed the blindfold. She was a pretty little thing, her blonde hair hung in loose curls, and her brown eyes were flecked with green. The girl smiled at Kalina and reached to touch the assassin's forehead. Kalina's back began sweating as she felt hundreds of eyes upon her. May Diana, the huntress and protector of the young, bless and keep you this year. I bestow upon you this golden arrow as a symbol of her power and good graces. The girl bowed as she extended the slender arrow. Keol prodded her back and Kalina grabbed the arrow. Eulimus, blessings to you, the girl said, and Kalina nodded her thanks. She gripped the arrow as the girl bounded away. It couldn't be used, of course. But it was made of solid gold. It'll fetch a nice price. With a shrug, Kalina handed the arrow to Keol. I suppose I'm not allowed to have this, she said, sitting down with the rest of the crowd. He put it back in her lap. I wouldn't want to test the gods. She stared at him for a moment. Did he look different? Something had changed in his face. Nudging him with an elbow, Kalina grinned. Chapter 38. Yards of silk, clouds of powder, brushes, combs, pearls, and diamonds glistened before Kalina's eyes. As Philippa arranged the last strand of Kalina's hair neatly around her face, secured a mask over her eyes and nose, and placed a small crystal tiara on her head, Kalina couldn't help but feel, despite herself, like a princess. Philippa knelt to polish the lump of crystal on Kalina's silver slippers. If I didn't know better, I'd call myself a fairy queen. It's like Philippa caught herself before she spoke the word the king of Adalan had so effectively outlawed, then quickly said, I barely recognize you. Good, Kalina said. This would be her first ball where she wasn't there to kill someone. True, she was mostly going to make sure Nehemiah didn't hurt herself or the court. But, a ball was a ball. Maybe if she was lucky, she could dance a little. Are you certain this is a good idea? Philippa asked quietly, standing. Captain Westfall won't be pleased. Kalina gave the servant a sharp look. I told you not to ask questions. Philippa huffed. Just don't tell them I helped you when you get dragged back here. Checking her irritation, Kalina strode to the mirror, Philippa bustling after her. Standing before her reflection, Kalina wondered if she was seeing correctly. This is the most beautiful dress I've ever worn, she admitted, her eyes filling with light. It was not pure white, but rather a grayish offset, and its white skins and bodice were encrusted with thousands of minuscule crystals that reminded Kalina of the surface of the sea. Swirls of silk thread on the bodice made rose-like designs that could have passed for a work by any master painter. A border of ermine lined the neck and provided slender sleeves that only covered her shoulders. Tiny diamond droplets fell from her ears, and her hair was curled and swept up onto her head, strands of pearls woven in. Her grey silk mask had been secured tightly against her face. It wasn't fashioned after anything, but the delicate crystal and pearl whorls had been crafted by a skilled hand. You could win the hand of a king, looking like that, said Philippa. Or perhaps a crown prince will do. Where in Erelia did you find this dress? Kalina murmured. Don't ask questions, clucked the old woman. Kalina smirked. Fair enough. She wondered why her heart now felt too large for her body, and why she was so unstable in her shoes. She had to remember why she was going, she had to keep her wits about her. The clock struck 9, and Philippa glanced toward the doorway, giving Kalina the opportunity to slip her makeshift knife down her bodice without being noticed. How, exactly, are you going to get to the ball? I don't think your guards will let you just walk out. Kalina shot Philippa a sly look. We're both going to pretend that I was invited by the Crown Prince, and right now you are going to make such a fuss about me being late that they won't object. Philippa fanned herself, her face reddening. Kalina grasped her hand. I promise, she said, if I get into any sort of trouble, I will swear to my last breath that you were deceived by me, and had no knowledge of anything. But are you going to get into trouble? Kalina gave her most winning smile. No. I'm just sick of being left to sit around while they have grand parties. It wasn't quite a lie. Gods help me, Philippa muttered, and took a deep breath. Go, she suddenly cried, herding Kalina toward the door to the hall. Go, you'll be late. She was a bit too loud to be totally convincing, but Philippa flung open the door to the hallway. The Crown Prince won't be pleased if you're late. Kalina paused in the doorway, nodding at the 5 guards who were posted outside, then looked back at Philippa. Thank you, Kalina said. No more dawdling, the servant woman cried, and almost knocked Kalina off her feet as she pushed her out the doorway and slammed it shut. Kalina turned to the guards. You look nice, one of them, Res, said shyly. Off to the ball, grinned another. Save a dance for me, will you, the third added. Not one of them questioned her. Kalina smiled and took Res's arm as he extended it to her. She tried not to laugh when he puffed out his chest. But as they neared the great hall and the sounds of a waltz could be heard, a swarm of bees took flight in her stomach. She couldn't forget why she was here. She'd played this part in the past, but it had ended in killing a stranger, not confronting a friend. The red and gold glass doors appeared, and she could see the wreaths and candles that bedecked the massive hall. It would have been easier if she could have slipped into the ball through a side door and remained unnoticed, but she hadn't had time to go exploring through the secret tunnels to find another way out of her rooms, and she certainly couldn't find another way into the ball now without raising suspicions. Res stopped and bowed. This is where I leave you, he said as seriously as he could, though he kept looking at the ball that lay at the foot of the stairs. Have a lovely night, Miss Sardathian. Thank you, Res. She felt an urge to vomit and run back to her rooms. Instead, she graciously nodded her farewell. She just had to make it down the stairs, and find a way to convince Keol to let her stay. Then she could keep an eye on Nehemiah all night. Her shoes seemed frail, and Kalina took a few steps back, ignoring the guards at the door as she lifted her feet high and set them down to test the strength of the chaise. Nihen, she was assured that not even a jump through the air could snap the heel. She approached the top of the stairs. Tucked into her bodice, the makeshift knife poked her skin. She prayed to the goddess, to every god she knew, to the Wyrd, to whatever was responsible for her fate, that she wouldn't have to use it. Kalina squared her shoulders and stepped forward. What was she doing here? Dorian almost dropped his drink as he saw Kalina Sardathian atop the stairs. Even with the mask, he recognized her. She might have her faults, but Kalina never did anything half-heartedly. She'd outdone herself with that dress. But what was she doing here? He couldn't tell if it were a dream or reality until several heads, then many, turned to knock. Though the waltz was playing, those not dancing quieted themselves as the mysterious masked girl lifted her skins and took a step, then another. Her dress was made of stars plucked from the sky, and the whirls of crystals in her grey mask glittered. Who is that? Breathed a young courtier beside him. She looked at no one as she descended the staircase, and even the Queen of Adalan stood to see the late arrival, Nehemiah also rising from her seat beside her. Had Kalina lost her mind? Walk to her. Take her hand. But his feet were leaden, and Dorian could do nothing except watch her. His skin flushed beneath his small black mask. He didn't know why, but seeing her made him feel like a man. She was something out of a dream in which he was not a spoiled young prince, but a king. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and Dorian took a step forward. But someone had already arrived, and Dorian clenched his jaw tight enough for it to hurt as she smiled and bowed to Keol. The captain of the guard, who hadn't bothered to wear a mask, extended his hand. Kalina stared only at Keol with those starlit eyes, and her long, white fingers floated through the air to meet his. The crowd began chattering as Keol led her from the stairs, and they disappeared into the throng. Whatever conversation they were about to have, it wasn't going to be pleasant. He'd be better off staying out of it. Please, said another courtier, tell me that Keol doesn't suddenly have a wife. Captain Westfall, said the courtier who had spoken earlier. Why would a pretty thing like that marry a guard? Remembering who stood beside him, he glanced at Dorian, who was still staring, wide-eyed, at the stairs. Vivo is she, your highness. Do you know her? No, I don't, whispered Dorian, and walked away. The waltz was driving and so loud she had difficulty hearing herself think as Keol pulled her into a shadowy alcove. Not surprisingly, he hadn't worn a mask, it would be too silly for him. Which made the fury on his face all too visible. So he seethed, holding tightly to her wrist. Do you want to tell me how you got it into your mind that this was a good idea? She tried shaking off his hand, but he wouldn't let go. Across the great hall, Nehemiah sat with the Queen of Adullam, occasionally glancing in Kalina's direction. Because she was nervous, or just surprised to see her. Relax, she hissed at the captain of the guard. I only wanted to have some fun. Crashing a royal ball is your idea of fun. Arguing wouldn't help. She could tell that his anger was mostly about being embarrassed that she'd managed to slip out of her rooms in the first place. So she gave him a pitiful pout. I was lonely. He choked. You couldn't spend one evening on your own. She twisted her wrist out of his grasp. Nox is here, and he's a thief. How could you let him come, with all this jewelry flashing about, and not me? How can I be the king's champion if you don't trust me? Actually, that was a question she really wanted to know the answer to. Keol covered his face with a hand and let out a long, long sigh. She tried not to smile. She'd won. If you take one step out of line, she grinned in earnest. Consider it your Eulimus present to me. Keol gave her a weighing look, but slumped his shoulders. Please don't make me regret this. She patted his cheek, sweeping past him. I knew I liked you for some reason. He said nothing, but followed her back into the crowd. She'd been to masked balls before, but there was still something unnerving about not being able to see the faces of those around her. Most of the court, Dorian included, wore masks of varying sizes, shapes, and colors, some of simple design, others elaborate and animal-shaped. Nehemiah still sat with the queen, wearing a gold and turquoise mask with a lotus motif. They appeared to be engaged in polite conversation, and Nehemiah's guards stood to the side of the dais, already looking bored. Keol kept close to her as she found an empty spot in the crowd and stopped. It was a good vantage point. She could see everything from here, the dais, the main stairs, the dance floor. Dorian was dancing with a small brunette with outrageously large breasts that he took no pains to avoid glancing at every so often. Hadn't he noticed her arrival? Even Purrington had seen her when Keol dragged her into that corner. Thankfully, the captain had subtly moved her away before she had to interact with him. Across the room, she met Nox's eye. He was flirting with a young woman wearing a dove mask, and he raised his glass in salute before turning back to the girl. He'd opted for a blue mask that concealed only his eyes. "Well, try not to have too much fun," Keol said beside her, crossing his hiding her skull. Kalina crossed her arms as well and began her vigil. An hour later, Kalina was beginning to curse herself for being a fool. Nehemiah was still sitting with the queen, and hadn't looked again in Kalina's direction. How had she even considered that Nehemiah, of all people, would attack everyone? Kalina's face burned with shame beneath the mask. She didn't deserve to call herself a friend. All the dead champions and mysterious evil powers and this ridiculous competition had made her go mad. Kalina smoothed the fur on her dress, frowning slightly. Keol remained beside her, saying nothing. Though he'd allowed her to stay, she doubted he'd soon forget this. Or that the guards wouldn't get the tongue-lashing of their lives later tonight. Kalina straightened as Nehemiah suddenly rose from her seat beside the queen's throne, her guards snapping to attention. She bowed her head to the queen, the light of the chandeliers making her mask glisten, and then strode off the dais. Kalina felt each of her heartbeats hammering in her veins as Nehemiah wove through the crowd, her guards close behind, and halted in front of Kalina and Keol. "You look beautiful, Lillian," Nehemiah said in the common tongue, her accent as thick as it had ever been. It felt like a slap in the face. She'd spoken with perfect fluency that night in the library. Was she warning Kalina to keep quiet about it? "As do you," Kalina said tightly. "Are you enjoying the ball?" Nehemiah played with a fold in her dress. And, from the look of the rich blue fabric, it was probably a gift from the Queen of Adalon. "Yes, but I'm not feeling well," the princess said. "I'm going back to my rooms." Kalina gave her a stiff nod. "I hope you feel better," was all she could think of to say. Nehemiah looked at her for a long moment, her eyes shining with what seemed like pain, and then left. Kalina watched her walk up the stairs, and didn't tear her gaze away until the princess was gone. Keol cleared his throat. "Do you want to tell me what that was all about?" "None of your business," she replied. Something could still happen, even if Nehemiah wasn't here, something could happen. But no. Nehemiah wouldn't repay pain with more pain. She was too good for that. Kalina swallowed hard. The makeshift knife in her bodice felt like a dead weight. Even if Nehemiah wasn't going to hurt anyone tonight, that didn't prove her innocence. "What's wrong?" Keol pressed. Forcing herself to push aside her shame and worry, Kalina lifted her chin. With Nehemiah gone, she still had to keep watch, but maybe she could attempt to have a little fun, too. "With you scowling at everyone, no one will ask me to dance." Keol's dark brows rose. "I'm not scowling at everyone." Even as he said it, she spotted him frowning at a passing courtier who looked too long in Kalina's direction. "Stop it," she hissed. "No one will ever ask me to dance if you keep doing that." He gave her an exasperated look and strode off. She followed him to the border of the dance floor. "Here," he said, standing at the edge of the sea of swirling gowns. "If anyone wants to ask you to dance, you're in plain sight." From this spot she could also still make sure no feral beasts were about to rip into the crowd. But he didn't need to know that. She glanced at him. "Would you like to dance with me?" He laughed. "With you? No." She looked at the marble floor, her chest tight. "You needn't be so cruel." "Cruel? Kalina, Purrington is just over there. I'm sure he's not happy about you being here, so I wouldn't risk drawing his attention any more than necessary, coward." Keol's eyes softened. "If he weren't here, I would have said yes. I can easily arrange that, you know." He shook his head as he adjusted the lapel on his black tunic. Just then Dorian waltzed by, sweeping the brunette with him. He didn't even glance at her. "Anyway," Keol added, jerking his chin at Dorian, I think you have far more attractive suitors vying for your attention. I'm boring company to keep. I don't mind being here with you. I'm sure you don't, Keol said dryly, though he met her stare. I mean it. Why aren't you dancing with anyone? Aren't there ladies whom you like? I'm the captain of the guard, I'm not exactly a catch for any of them. There was some sorrow in his eyes, though it was well concealed. Are you mad? You're better than everyone in here. And you're very handsome, she said, taking his hand in her free one. There was beauty in Keol's face, and strength, and honor, and loyalty. She stopped hearing the crowd, and her mouth became dry as he stared at her. How had she missed it for so long? You think so, he said after a moment, looking at their clasped hands. She tightened her grasp. Ivhy, if I wasn't, why aren't you two dancing? Keol dropped her hand. She had difficulty turning away from him. And with whom would I dance, Your Highness? Dorian was alarmingly handsome in his pewter tunic. One might say it matched her dress. You look radiant, he said. And you look radiant as well, Keol. He winked at his friend. Then Dorian's gaze met hers, and Kalina's blood turned into shooting stars. Well. Do I need to lecture you about how stupid it was to sneak into the ball, or can I just ask you to dance with me instead? I don't think that's a good idea, Keol said. Why? They asked in unison. Dorian stepped a little closer to her. Even though she was ashamed of herself for believing such awful things about Nehemiah, knowing that Dorian and Keol were safe made the misery worth it. Because it attracts too much attention, that's why. Kalina rolled her eyes, and Keol glared at her. Do I have to remind you who you are? No. You remind me every day, she retorted. His brown eyes darkened. What was the point in being nice to her if he was only going to insult her the next moment? Dorian put a hand on her shoulder and gave Keol a charming smile. Relax, Keol, he said, and his hand slipped to rest on her back, his fingers grazing her bare skin. Just take the night off. Dorian turned her from the captain. It'll do you some good, he said over his shoulder, though the merriness faded from his tone. I'm getting a drink, muttered Keol, and walked away. She watched the captain for a moment. It would be a miracle if he considered her a friend. Dorian caressed her back, and she looked at him. Her heart jumped into a gallop, and Keol dissolved from her thoughts, like dew beneath the morning sun. She felt bad for forgetting him, but... Oh, she wanted Dorian, she couldn't deny it. She wanted him. You look beautiful, Dorian said quietly, running an eye over her in a way that made her ears burn. I haven't been able to stop staring at you. Oh. And I thought you hadn't even noticed me. Keol got there first when you arrived. And besides, I had to work up the nerve to approach you. He grinned. You're very intimidating. Especially with the mask. And I suppose it didn't help that you had a line of ladies waiting to dance with you. I'm here now, aren't I? Her heart tightened, and she realized it wasn't the answer she'd been hoping for. What did she want from him? He held out his hand, inclining his head. Dance with me. Was there music playing? She'd forgotten. The world had shrunk into nothing, dissolved by the golden glow of candles. But there were her feet, and here was her arm, and her neck, and her mouth. She smiled and took his hand, still keeping one eye on the ball around them. Chapter 39. He was lost in a world of which he'd always dreamed. Her body was warm beneath his hand, and her fingers were soft around his. He spun her and led her about the floor, waltzing as smoothly as he could. She didn't falter a single step, nor did she seem to care about the many angry female faces that watched as dance after dance passed and they didn't switch partners. Of course, it wasn't polite for a prince to dance with only one lady, but he couldn't focus on anything beyond his partner and the music that carried them onward. "You certainly have a lot of stamina," she said. When had they last spoken? It could have been 10 minutes or an hour ago. The masked faces around them blurred together. "While some parents hit their children, mine also punished me with dancing lessons." "Then you must have been a very naughty boy." She glanced around the ball, as if she were looking for something, or someone. "You're gracious with your compliments tonight." He twirled her. The skirts of her gown sparkled underneath the chandelier. "It's Eulimus," she said. "Everyone's kind on Eulimus." A flash of what he could have sworn was pain shone in her eyes, but it was gone before he could be certain of it. He caught her around the waist, his feet moving to the beat of the waltz. "And how's your present?" "Oh, she hid under my bed, then in the dining room, which is where I left her." "You locked the dog in your dining room?" "Should I have kept her in my bedroom, where she could ruin the carpets? Or in the gaming room, where she might eat the chess pieces and choke?" "Perhaps you should have sent her to the kennels, where dogs belong." "On Eulimus. I couldn't think of sending her back to that wretched place." He suddenly felt the urge to kiss her, hard, upon the mouth. But this, what he felt, it could never be real. Because once the ball was over, she would go back to being an assassin, and he would still be a prince. Dorian swallowed hard. For tonight, though he held her closer. Everyone transformed into mere shadows on the wall. Frowning, Keol watched his friend dance with the assassin. He wouldn't have danced with her, anyway. And he was glad he hadn't worked up the nerve to ask her, not after seeing the color that Duke Purrington's face turned upon discovering the pair. A courtier named Utho stepped beside Keol. "I thought she was with you." "Who?" "Lady Lillian." "So that's her name. I've never seen her before. Is she newly arrived to court?" "Yes," said Keol. Tomorrow, he'd have a word with her guards about letting Kalina out tonight. Hopefully by then, he'd be less inclined to knock their heads together. "How are you doing, Captain Westfall?" Utho said, clapping him on the back a bit too hard. His breath reeked of wine. "You don't dine with us anymore." "I stopped dining at your table 3 years ago, Utho." "You should come back, we miss your conversation." It was a lie. Utho only wanted information about the foreign young lady. His reputation with women was well known in the castle, so well known that he had to seize courtiers as they arrived or go into Rifthold for a different sort of woman. Keol watched Dorian dip Kalina, watched the way her lips widened in a smile and her eyes burst with light as the crown prince said something. Even with the mask on, Keol could see the happiness written across her face. "Is he with her?" Utho asked. "The Lady Lillian belongs to herself, and no one else." "So she's not with him?" "No." Utho shrugged. "That's strange." "Why?" Keol had the sudden urge to strangle him. "Because it looks like he's in love with her," he said, and walked away. Keol's eyes lost focus for a moment. Then Kalina laughed, and Dorian kept staring at her. The prince hadn't once taken his eyes off her. Dorian's expression was full of something. Joy. Wonder. His shoulders were straight, his back erect. He looked like a man. Like a king. It was impossible for such a thing to have occurred, and when would it have happened? Utho was a drunk and a womanizer. What did he know of love? Dorian spun Kalina with speed and dexterity, and she snapped into his arms, her shoulders rising with exhilaration. But she wasn't in love with him. Utho hadn't said that. He had seen no attachment on her part. And Kalina would never be that stupid. It was Dorian who was the fool, Dorian who would have his heart broken, if he did actually love her. Unable to look at his friend any longer, the captain of the guard left the ball. Kaltain watched in rage and agony as Lilian Gordana and the Crown Prince of Adalin danced and danced and danced. Even with a much more concealing mask, she would have recognized the upstart. And what sort of a person wore grey to a ball? Kaltain looked down at her dress and smiled. Bright shades of blue, emerald, and soft brown, her gown and matching peacock mask had cost as much as a small house. It was all a gift from Purrington, of course, along with the jewelry that decorated much of her neck and arms. It was certainly not the dull, drab mess of crystal that the conniving harlot wore. Purrington stroked her arm, and Kaltain turned to him with fluttering eyelashes. "You look handsome tonight, my love," she said, adjusting a gold chain across his red tunic. His face quickly matched the color of his clothes. She wondered if she could bear the repulsion of kissing him. She could always keep refusing, just as she had for the past month, but when he was this drunk, she would have to think of a way out as soon as possible. But she was no closer to Dorian than she'd been in early autumn, and would certainly make no progress with Lilian in the way. A precipice opened before her. Her head gave a brief, faint throb of pain. There were no other options now. Lilian had to be eliminated. Even the clock chimed 3 and most of the guests, including the Queen and Keol, had left. Kalina finally decided that it was safe for her to leave. So she slipped from the ball when Dorian went to get a drink and found Ress waiting outside to escort her back. The halls of the castle were silent as they strode to her room, taking the empty servants' passages to avoid any curious courtiers learning more about her. Even if she'd gone to the ball for the wrong reasons, she had had some fun dancing with Dorian. More than some, actually. She smiled to herself, picking at her nails as they entered the hallway that led to her rooms. The rush of having Dorian look not only at her, talk only to her, treat her as if she were his equal and more hadn't yet worn off. Maybe her plan hadn't been such a failure after all. Ress cleared his throat, and Kalina looked up to see Dorian standing outside her rooms, chatting with the guards. He couldn't have stayed long at the ball if he'd beaten her back here. Her heart pounded, but she managed a coy smile as Dorian bowed to her, opened the door, and they went inside. Let Ress and the guards think what they wanted. She unfastened the mask from her face, tossing it onto the table in the center of the foyer, and sighed as the cool air met her flushed skin. "Well?" she asked, leaning against the wall beside the door to her bedroom. Dorian approached her slowly, halting only a hand's breadth away. "You left the ball without saying goodbye," he said, and braced an arm against the wall beside her head. She raised her eyes, examining the black detail on the sleeve that fell just above her hair. "I'm impressed you got up here so quickly, and without a pack of court ladies hounding after you. Perhaps you should try your hand at being an assassin." He shook the hair out of his face. "I'm not interested in court ladies," he said thickly, and kissed her. His mouth was warm, and his lips were smooth, and Kalina lost all sense of time and place as she slowly kissed him back. He pulled away for a moment, looked into her eyes as they opened, and kissed her again. It was different this time, deeper, full of need. Her arms were heavy and light all at once, and the room twirled round and round. She couldn't stop. She liked this, liked being kissed by him, liked the smell and the taste and the feel of him. His arm slipped around her waist and he held her tightly to him as his lips moved against hers. She put a hand on his shoulder, her fingers digging into the muscle that lay beneath. How different things were between them than when she'd first seen him in Endovia. Her eyes opened. Endovia. Why was she kissing the Crown Prince of Adalin? Her fingers loosened and her arm dropped to her side. He removed his mouth from hers and smiled. It was infectious. Dorian leaned forward again, but she smoothly put 2 fingers against his lips. "I should go to bed," she said. He raised his eyebrows. "Alone?" she added. He removed her fingers from his mouth. He tried to kiss her, but she easily swung under his arm and reached for the door handle. She had opened the bedroom door and slid inside before he could stop her. She peered into the foyer, watching as he continued to smile. "Good night." Dorian leaned against the door, bringing his face close to hers. "Good night," he whispered, and she didn't stop him as he kissed her again. He broke it off before she was ready, and she almost fell onto the ground as he removed his weight from the door. He laughed softly. "Good night," she said again, heat rushing to her face. Then he was gone. Kalina strode to the balcony and flung open the doors, embracing the chill air. Her hand rose to her lips and she stared up at the stars, feeling her heart grow, and grow, and grow. Dorian walked slowly back to his rooms, his heart racing. He could still feel her lips on his, smell the scent of her hair, and see the gold in her eyes flickering in the candlelight. Consequences be damned. He'd find a way to make it work, he'd find a way to be with her. He had to. He had leapt from the cliff. He could only wait for the net. In the garden, the captain of the guard stared up at the young woman's balcony, watching as she waltzed alone, lost in her dreams. But he knew that her thoughts weren't of him. She stopped and stared upward. Even from a distance, he could see the blush upon her cheeks. She seemed young, no, new. It made his chest ache. Still, he watched until she sighed and went inside. She never bothered to look below. Chapter 40. Kalina groaned as something cold and wet brushed her cheek and moved to lick her face. She opened an eye and found the puppy looking down at her, its tail wagging. Adjusting herself in the bed, she winced at the sunlight. She hadn't meant to sleep in. They had a test in 2 days, and she needed to train. It was their last test before the final duel, the test that decided who the 4 finalists would be. Kalina rubbed an eye and then scratched the dog behind the ears. "Have you peed somewhere and wish to tell me about it?" "Oh no," said someone as the bedroom door swung open. "Dorian. I took her out at dawn with the other dogs." She smiled weakly as he approached. "Isn't it rather early for a visit?" "Early?" He laughed, sitting on the bed. She inched away. "It's almost 1 in the afternoon. Philippa told me you've been sleeping like the dead all morning." 1. She'd slept that long. What about lessons with Keol? She scratched her nose and pulled the puppy onto her lap. At least nothing had happened last night. If there had been another attack, she would have heard about it already. She almost sighed with relief, though the guilt of what she'd done, how little faith she'd had in Nehemiah, still made her a tad miserable. "Have you named her yet?" he asked, casual, calm, collected. Was he acting that way for show, or was their kiss just not that important to him? "No," she said, keeping her face neutral, even though she wanted to scream from the awkwardness. "I can't think of anything appropriate." "What about?" he said, tapping his chin. "Gold, that's the stupidest name I've ever heard. Can you think of something better?" She picked up one of the dog's legs and examined the soft paws. She squished the padded foot beneath her thumb. Fleetfoot. It was a perfect name. In fact, it felt as if the name had existed all along, and she'd finally been clairvoyant enough to stumble across it. "Yes, Fleetfoot it is." "Does it mean anything?" he asked, and the dog raised her head to look at it. "It'll mean something when she outruns all of your purebreds." Kalina scooped the dog into her arms and kissed her head. She bounced her arms up and down, and Fleetfoot stared up into her eyes with a wrinkled brow. She was absurdly soft and cuddly. Dorian chuckled. "We'll see." Kalina set the dog down on the bed. Fleetfoot promptly crawled under the blankets and disappeared. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Yes. Though it seems you didn't, if you were up so early." "Listen," he began, and Kalina wanted to throw herself from the balcony. "Last night. I'm sorry if I was too forward with you." He paused. "Kalina, you're macking." Had she been making a face? Sorry it did upset you, then. What did? The kiss. Phlegm caught in her throat, and the assassin coughed. Oh, it was nothing, she said, thumping her chest as she cleared her throat. I didn't mind it. But I didn't hate it, if that's what you're thinking. She immediately regretted saying it. So, you liked it? He grinned lazily. No. Oh, go away. She flung herself onto her pillows, pulling the blankets above her head. She was going to die from embarrassment. Fleetfoot licked her face as she hid in the darkness of the sheets. Come now, he said. From your reaction, one would think you'd never been kissed. She threw back the blankets, and Fleetfoot burrowed farther beneath. Of course I've been kissed, she snapped, trying not to think about Sam and what she'd shared with him. But it wasn't by some stuffed shirt, pompous, arrogant princeling. He looked down at his chest. Stuffed shirt. Oh, hush up, she said, hitting him with a pillow. She moved to the other side of the bed, got up, and walked to the balcony. She felt him watching her, staring at her back and the 3 scars she knew her low-cut nightgown did nothing to hide. Are you going to remain here while I change? She faced him. He wasn't looking at her the way he had the night before. There was something wary in his gaze, and something unspeakably sad. Her blood thrummed in her veins. Well. Your scars are awful, he said, almost whispering. She put a hand on her hip and walked to the dressing room door. We all bear scars, Dorian. Mine just happen to be more visible than most. Sit there if you like, but I'm going to get dressed. She strode from the room,